Okay. Ayan!
Yan.
Ayan! Kamusta kayo dyan? Okay. Project Pilipinas, 40 na tayo. Matanda na tayo, bro. Episode 40. Ayan. Perfect timing. Meron tayong very special guest, pero medyo kilala niyo na yan. Of course, we have our historiador friend, our makulit friend, soon-to-be vlogger friend, and join us back in the Philippines friend, Dr. Lisandro Claudio from UC Berkeley. Kamusta dyan? Thank you very much for joining us, Leloy.
Salamat, Richard. I'm nag-empake. Pauwi ako ng Pilipinas sa ngayong gabi. Thanks for having me.
Ayan na, umanda na mga ano dyan. Mga kaibigan mo dyan sa Pilipinas. Ayan, Leloy. Okay, so what we're gonna do today is abusuin ka namin before ka lumipat sa Pilipinas. We do two things, no? So two-part discussion tayo. Shortly, hindi na tayo katulad dati na Joe Rogan kasi si Mark medyo pagod na yata si Mark. Mahaba yung araw niya. We won't do the 3 hours. We'll just do short style. So maybe for the next 20 to 25 minutes, pag-usapan muna natin, Leloy, no? Ang pagbabalik ng Reymen Marcos. Alright? I mean, to put things in perspective, okay? What does that mean? And by the way, you know, I'm not trying to trivialize this. I'm just saying, like, for some people, maybe the first one was tragedy and this one is farce, right? To use the Karl Marx way of looking at it. But you as a historian, how do you, in one word, first of all, paano mo ma-describe ang pagbabalik ng mga Marcos sa Malacanang?
Well, yun nga, balikan natin yung first strategy, second time of farce. And that was a reference to Napoleon, di ba? So yung first pagbalik ni Napoleon, he was an emperor who tried to colonize Europe. And then si Louis Napoleon, who was the nephew of Napoleon, when he became emperor, medyo mas circumscribed yung goals niya.
Right.
And yung mga kanya mga imperial endeavors were things like, for example, sending a Habsburg Maximilian to take over Mexico and then pumalpak yung...
Pinatay din yan, di ba? Pinatay yan, di ba? Yeah.
He tried to regain yung mga utang nila from Mexico and from other countries. So it was rather constrained, and then at one point in his administration, actually Louis Napoleon tried to liberalize France. So we don't know. So the second time, which is indeed a farce, you have to put a question mark. What kind of farce will you see? Will it be a term you like to use, Richard, yung minimalist ba or maximalist? You
Right.
get a minimalist Marcos or a maximalist Marcos? So far, and based on yung foreign media commentates na narinig ko, you seem to be getting a kind of middle of the road kind of Marcos. Parang it seems like he's going to be a normal post-EDSA president so far. And what does that mean? I'm not saying that's going to be a good presidency dahil marami namang post-EDSA presidency na palpak. But what I mean to say is that he's not going to stay for 30 years the way his father did. I don't think so, at least. Because yung rules of the game have changed.
Right. Mark, do you have a question before we push on this? Kasi very interesting point yan. I mean, of course, my argument is... Yes, go Mark, go.
Parang yung kakapasok pa lang nila, yung watch kaagad yung napansin, pagkatapos yung party kay Imelda. So parang, parang back to the glory days of the Marcos, yung mga malaking parties and ano. Do you think ganun yung mangyayari ngayon dito sa presidency ni Bongbong?
I was looking at yung party, yung sinasabi nila yung ball na there were titas lasting after Borgie Manotok dun sa video. Actually,
Oh my goodness. Hindi ko nakita yung Borgie Manotok angle, ha? Okay, go.
Doon pa ako na to. Pero parang grande siya, pero hindi pa rin siya kasing grande ng mga yacht parties nung panahon ni Apo Lakay mismo. So,
Right.
even that is a kind of constrained version of Marcos opulence. So we'll see. Hindi pa rin ako sigurado. I mean, it's annoying, pero hindi pa rin yung nakakasuka levels kagaya ng 80s.
So, hindi Duterte light, Marcos light ang Marcos the second.
Marcos light.
Parang ganun eh. No, parang Marcos light ang labas eh.
May lightness and even in the rhetoric, there's kind of creeping authoritarianism dun sa rhetoric, pero constrained. Hindi niya sinasabi na I will centralize power or we need a system that arrogates power onto me. But what he's saying is that akong bahala sa inyo. Kahit wala kayong gawin,
Correct.
President, ako do my job. And this is the opposite of yung kind of citizen empowerment rhetoric ng opposition. Na, you know, kasi pansinin mo si Pinoy, for example, he used the word tayo, he used the word we, he's always saying tulungan niyo ako, 'di ba? Kalbaryo ko to, kailangan may kasama kayo. Si Marcos is always like, I built this. Gagawin ko ito. Pwede niyo tulungan, pwede kayong mag-relax, kayo bahala, pero gagawin ko pa rin ito.
obviously you're referring to some of the lines in Inauguration, which I want to talk about more, no?
Inauguration.
Because I also want to talk about the choice of the venue. The last president that gave a speech there was Rojas, Manuel Rojas. He was a wartime president. The two before him were Laurel and Quezon. Not necessarily also the happiest time for the Philippines. These were tough times. We can discuss that more. But before that, I just want to ask, did you see this coming? And I'm not saying 1 month ago, 6 months ago. I'm saying years ago when you were becoming a historian, when you were starting your career as an historian. Leloy, did you see this coming? And Marcos 2.0?
Hindi talaga. Because I thought laos na yung mga Marcoses. So, I was saying the last time nasa podcast ako, the first time I heard pro-Marcos propaganda on social media, akala ko it was fringe. I related it to the way American liberals related to the alt-right memes in 2010. That's fringe. That's never going to hit the mainstream. And then, of course, we know what happened to the alt-right. It made the mainstream. And then we know what happened to that pro-Marcos.
Yung QAnon na, diba? It's like, 25, 30 million I mean, it's insane. It's a major religion. I mean, sorry.
And then you have people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, of course,
right.
who are being elected into the House of Representatives. That was unthinkable mga 15 years ago. And I thought 10, 15 years ago, unthinkable din yung Marcos restoration. But of course, that's because like I was stupid. Like, 86 pa lang, evenly divided. Yung 86 dinaya ni Marcos si Cory doon, pero malapit yun, kaya niya kayang dayain yun. So you already had an evenly split country. And even at that time when you had like 41% after EDSA, 41% of Filipinos saying that Marcos was a thief. And then parang high 30s saying that he wasn't a thief. 69% of Filipinos perceived him as a brave president. This is 86, Richard. So,
right.
Na 86 pa lang yung Marcos restoration.
Di ba you posted that? There was a survey. Mark, magandang pag-usapan yan. Kasi parang you posted a survey. Was this 1990, 1991 that said Marcos, most people... Yeah, exactly. Yes. Public opinion report. Kasi for me, if nagsama si Imelda and si Danding, hindi sila naging bakaw, nanalo na sila noong 1992 eh. They would have gotten 28.4% of the votes. 23, 24 lang si Ramos eh. Diba? So, they could have been back as early as 1992. Kaya, for me, we're always vulnerable. Eh. Again, I'm not saying this now. I mean, you could see my writings through and through. Duterte pa lang, alam ko na may chance to eh, 2015, diba? So, I was always skeptical about the resilience of our institutions.
Last podcast natin, Richard, di ba, yung sinabi mo, dark horse candidate si Duterte. Sabi ko, dark horse, but no chance. But you actually entertained the possibility.
This was August 2015, nung he was barely 3%, 4%. So, yun lang. Or maybe siguro, because I come from the North and I'm familiar with how powerful the Marcos myth is, a part of me felt maybe it's a matter of time the rest of the country jumps on it. Mark, you want to ask something on this also, on the inevitability or non-inevitability of Marcoses? Ikaw, Mark.
Hindi, yun nga, parang kasi the whole time, people were expecting Sara to run eh.
Right.
Parang ganun, everyone was preparing for a battle with Duterte, everyone was,
correct.
Tapos biglang nakasingit itong si Marcos and sa'yo, Prof, what do you think yung sa mga Duterte, what role did Duterte play in this whole resurgence of the Marcoses?
Yeah, did it have to? Would Marcos have made it back to power had it not been for the Dutertes? Let's say someone else won in 2016. Let's say graceful.
I don't think so.
Right.
I don't think so. Parang numbers game lang naman yan, di ba? Kasi kung titignan mo yung numbers, binigay ng Dutertes yung Mindanao kay Marcos.
And Visayan vote.
Richard Manolo Quezon has pointed this out. Ang laki talaga ng bump na natanggap ni BBM nung sinuportan siya ni Sara. And then of course, middle of last year, it looked like a parang 3-person race, 4-person race. Parang bukas sa bukas.
Yes.
Pwede manalo si Isko, pwede manalo si Lenny, pwede manalo si Marcos, pwede manalo si Sara. It looked like it could have been a 92. Yung parang sobrang dami na sobrang dikit.
Correct.
Pero nagkaroon ng big coalition.
Right.
Hanggang burado lahat talaga nung pumasok yung coalition, ng Marcos, Duterte, Arroyo coalition.
Kaya the contingency matters, no? Like, there was nothing inevitable because, ang dami nagalit sa akin from, from the north, including some relatives, when I said Marcos owes this a lot to the Dutertes, right? Marcos was 13%, right, in second quarter of Pulse Asia last year. Sara was 25, 27, 28, 30%, right, with margin of error. So I just don't see how Marcos could have made it to 58% without Sara being half of the story at least, diba? And I think President Duterte knows that, and that's why perhaps he was not so happy about the outcome, even if number 2 yung anak niya. But before that, Leloy,
Kaya galit na galit si tatay, di ba?
I mean, you could see it, right?
Talking about how long it took for tatay to congratulate and to acknowledge the new president, di ba? Kasi nauna pa ata yung US ambassador or yung US government, yung Secretary of State, acknowledge yung result ng election kaysa kay tatay Digong mismo. As even now, you notice, he'll never refer to him as Bongbong, President Marcos, Mr. Marcos. Tulungan natin si Marcos. Laging ganun. So even sa language na ngayon that he's accommodating, there's a kind of bitterness left.
And he skipped the inauguration right away. Andyan na nga si FBR eh. I mean, andyan si ERAP eh, di ba? But wala si Digong.
Si tatay nasa Greenbelt kumakain.
Ayan tayo eh. Mga Marites. Mark, may tanong ka dyan. Because before that, I want to go to Leloy. Kasi Leloy, you know this very well. I kind of got caught into this because, let's be honest, a part of this story is also the opposition, or lack thereof of the opposition, right? I mean, something also didn't go very right with the opposition. Or maybe you disagree with me. It's fine with that. Kasi ako, Leloy, I'm looking around the world. I'm looking at our Latino brothers. One after the other, they're beating the right-wingers, right? Whether it's Chile, whether it's Peru, and these countries are...
Bolsonaro, you're next.
Exactly. And Lula could be next, right? So, my point is, well, katulad natin sila in many ways. Disinformation, education. So, for me, the part of the story is also the opposition, or some mistakes they may have done, or some of the things that they did not maximize. As much as I want to be fair, because Lenny was against Marcos plus Sara, essentially combined. So, that was always hard. But I want to talk to you, because you're a very sensible guy, and you're openly a supporter of Vice President Leni Robredo, right? So, I want to discuss with you, what do you think went right, and what do you think didn't go right with the opposition? Kasi alam ko si Mark has a lot to say on that. Marati kami nag-usap on this too eh.
So I think it was too late to declare candidacy like
October.
Ganyan. Kung papalagan mo yung ganong kalaki na coalition, you have to start early. So partida yun eh. Having said that, Richard, sorry, I need to preface the statement by saying that why the opposition lost is not primarily because of things they didn't do. It's primarily because they went up against the biggest political juggernaut we've seen in recent memory. So, preface ko yun din. Having said that, you can still tweak the strategy of the opposition, of course. So, let's begin with yung campaign tagline. Yung sa gobyernong tapat, angat buhay lahat. That's essentially a retread of walang korap, walang mahirap. Kasi walang korap, gobyernong tapat. Walang mahirap is angat buhay lahat. So, reduce corruption, you increase prosperity. Now, empirically, that's not true even, right? China is very corrupt, and yet it's becoming very prosperous, right? Korea was very corrupt, and it's becoming very prosperous. Pangalawa, yung apilang anti-corruption na wala na. So, let's look at the data. For example, in 2010, 46, the number one reason for voting for Noynoy Aquino, 46% said that they voted for, among the voters, so rank the reasons why you vote for a candidate. 46% said they voted for him because he was a clean candidate with a good record. So gumagana yung anti-corruption discourse. By the time you get to Duterte, there are top two reasons for voting Duterte. The first reason was, entay siya at around 22%. Because he had a clean record and because he could do something. So yung idea of being active was already very, very important.
Competence.
Marcos, overwhelmingly, the people who voted for him because they said he could do something. And only 8% voted for him because they thought he was clean. Whereas yung kay Robredo, the number one reason for voting for her, 36%, was anti-corruption clean record. So what does this tell us? Patay na yung anti-corruption discourse. Hindi na gumagana. Mangangako ka na lang, malinis ako, pagkatiwalaan niyo ko, and everything will be fine. People want a candidate that will do something. So for example, yung kay Robredo, yung economic policy niya, sabi niya, jobs policy. You can watch the YouTube video. She says, the first prong of my job policy is ibalik yung tiwala. Pag may tiwala, babalik ang kumpiyansa, darating yung investors. Actually, that's a very passive approach. And there I say, it's a market-driven approach. In other words, honest ako, the market will take care of the jobs. That's not what people are looking for. People are looking for something strong. Ano ba yung gagawin mo? Diba? Kasi yun
Proactive.
yung importante ngayon may magagawa ka ba?
Correct.
So yung opposition, I think, needs to take a different tack. Bitawan na yung old good governance rhetoric. I'm not saying corruption is good.
Yeah.
But I'm saying you cannot just hang your hat on saying, malinis ako, magtiwala kayo sa akin. Sawa na yung taong bayad doon.
Ikaw, Mark, ano take mo dyan? Yeah.
Ang sa akin din, ang tatanong ko lang din, kay Leloy, kasi ang parang nakita ko din, yung for the last 6 years, yung onslaught ng atake kay Leni Robredo sa Liberal Party, sa social media, and mga YouTube, and yung mga pages, parang hindi sila nakarespond ng maayos eh. Parang hindi nila na-address yung mga paninira for 6 years. Hinayaan lang nila, tatawagin silang dilawan, tatawagin silang. So, yun, tingin mo.
And Lenny barely giving any interviews, right? I mean, Lele, I have many international news reporters, friends saying like, what's up? I mean, she was not giving interviews to anyone all those years. I mean,
si Vice, ayaw niya tumakbo eh. Ayaw naman talaga tumakbo ni VP Lenny. But Mark, what were you saying? Sorry.
Please go ahead.
And then yung pangalawa naman is yung
Sorry,
parang,
but,
yung iba naman, sinasabi nila, ayaw nila yung oppose si VP Lenny doon sa mga ginagawa ni Tatay Digo. So, yung dalawang factor na yun.
So, obstructionist. Parang obstructionist ang tingin.
Actually, malinaw yan. Parang negative yung perception na kung obstructionist ka, negative perception yung the survey data bears that out. So, kasi parang yung discourse nga ng pasaway, di ba? Pero I think din kasi kaya ayaw magbigay to be fair to VP Lenny, one of the reasons why hindi siya gano'n nagde-defend is because late siya nag-decide na tatakbo siya eh. So, hindi siya ambisyoso na tao. So, that's a good thing and that's a bad thing. Hindi siya ambisyoso. Sometimes Filipinos like yung hindi ambisyoso, parang Noynoy, parang napilitan.
Reluctant.
But at the same time, kung reluctant ka, hindi ka maghahanda ng maaga. Kasi hindi mo pinag-iisipan eh. Kasi ayaw mo, wala sa ambisyon mo. So I think she should have prepared.
Or people could see it as indecisive.
Over-prepared candidates like Binay, for example,
Right.
is an over-prepared candidate nag-fizzle out early.
Isko also, yeah. Isko was the Binay of these elections, right? Like he came in strong and then it just imploded and fizzled out. We can have a total different episode on that, Mark, no? But going back to this, what about the whole Google Trends, the whole attack on Pulse Asia, our colleagues, our friends? That got a bit nasty, didn't it, Leloy? I mean, you were among few people, supporters of Lenny, who was brave enough to go against the grain as far as the echo chambers in that side is concerned, right? Yeah.
Pero hindi lang naman ako, like, kung pakinggan natin yung mga nasa loob ng kampanya, the people who were actually looking at the data, wala naman silang ilusyon. Si Edwin Lasherda, for example, said he never had any reason to doubt.
Yeah, Edwin, yes, true.
Asia. Yeah, he said that on a Raptor interview. Yung problema yung mga followers eh, na kung ano-anong mga conspiracy theory yung pinapaniwalaan. Like yung Google Trends, that conversation should have never been had because there's a difference between purposive sampling and the random data na kinukuha mo sa internet and that has no meaning, right? Somebody searching for Leni Robredo is value neutral. It doesn't say whether or not
could be hating that person and then you're still searching.
Could be hate searching for all we know. And then of course, like if you look at Google Trends, people don't use Google in the Philippines to look for to learn about politics. They use Facebook. Tapos yung sa Google if you look at the number one Google searches from Filipinos, it concerns the NBA.
I thought porn. Okay, yeah. Okay.
Porn ba? Pero NBA dwarfs politics.
Right. I know. So yeah, you're right. I like the Facebook part because Facebook is like our political internet, right? It's like a Google for politics, right? And what about the TikTok aspect? Do you see that as a game changer, Leloy, based on the data you see, some of the analysis you see out there?
Wala pa, hindi ko alam yung data, pero the nice thing about, or the advantageous thing about TikTok is, hindi kailangan ni Bongbong Marcos magsinungaling doon, right? His TikTok was not a TikTok of disinformation. It was a TikTok where he was subtly flexing his wealth, di ba? Parang i-interview niya, mag-uusap sila ni Sandro, tapos palatial yung bahay. Very subtle. Diba? So naging aspiration, naging luxury.
Aspirational, yeah.
Presidential yung dating, ganun.
Yeah, ikaw Mark, anong take mo dyan? sa TikTok aspect. Do you think, Mark, that was a game changer? Ikaw, nag-introduce sa akin ng TikTok. Lele, may TikTok ka na? Hindi pa.
Wala, hindi ko kaya.
There's a way. I'm not dancing at all. I'm just saying there's a way to do it. Don't worry.
Ako siguro for the yung youth vote eh. I think TikTok ang malaki ang sway sa Kasi for yung mga bata,
Tama. Gen Z.
18, 20 years old
Yeah.
na walang ka-idea sa martial law, tapos sa TikTok nila makikita, tapos yung mga idol nila, nakikita nila, yung mga influencers supporting Bongbong Marcos, and they are making Lenny look weak, or they're making fun of the kakampings. So parang, for the youth vote, I think very influential talaga yung sa TikTok. For the older ones, dun yung mga YouTube, parang nando sila.
So, kasi the algorithm is wilder, Leloy. I mean, if you look at the studies, my own personal experience, di ba? Biglang, you put some weird things there, it goes 1 million views. Like, what? Like, how did that happen? It's so wild. TikTok is so wild. I don't see any platform like that. Kaya, if you're glitzy, glamorous, like the Marcoses, I mean, Marcos is almost like a BTS star. I mean, look at the TikTok. Like, his hairstyle is BTS, bomber jacket, V-cut shirt, diba? Paul Soriano, cinematography, right? I mean, it's perfect for TikTok, right? That's exactly what it's all about, glitz and glamour. And short, boom. Walang drama, straight glamour, right?
So lapat na siya, yung format, lapat na sa Marcos brand.
Exactly. Like, it was made for the Marcoses, just to be honest. Or essential influencers of, let's just say, the most cutting-edge, unabashed influencers. Let's just put it that way, right? I want to use other adjectives, but I already skipped that. The other thing I want to ask you, Leloy, there are people who are saying that 58% for Marcos is vast majority of that is soft voters. And a lot of that is, and let me credit Senator Lacson for kind of saying this. A lot of that is just people don't want liberals back. So it's like, if Marcos is our guy to beat the other side, kahit mas prefer ko si Isko or si Lacson, dito na ako kay Marcos kasi siya yung pinaka-sure. Do you buy that point of view? Because it may have, based on anecdotal evidence, it may have some strength. Di ba, Mark? Parang medyo ganun eh. Oo. Ikaw, Lele, what's your take?
Di ba yung mga pag-aaral ni Marco Garito, may pagkaparang ganun na rin yung pinupuntahan, di ba? Yung mga
Correct.
ethnographic data. And I think even si Nicole Curato is revealing some of that in ethnographic data. So,
Right.
So I buy that. And I think yung solution talaga dito is for the Liberal Party to come. Well, there's one solution. Yung unang solution, sabi ni Randy David, abolish the Liberal Party, get rid of
Wow! Really? Sabi ni Randy David?
Or parang drop it. Sinabi niya sa show ni Howie Severino na effectively parang
Yan, nag-back-to-back tayo dyan, di ba?
Independent. She's already signaling na parang tapos na yung Liberal Party, right? Pero I don't think the Liberal Party is going to be abolished. I don't think they're going to move on from that party. I think the second solution is to apologize. To apologize dun sa mga pagkukulang at dun sa pagiging manhid. I think
Mea culpa.
apology is one of the strongest forms of political ang top political rhetoric in the Philippines. Kasi gusto ng mga Pilipino yung pagpapakumbaba.
Correct.
So I can imagine, a new head of the Liberal Party or even Lenny saying, may tiwala kayo sa amin noong 2016, aaminin ko na wala namin yung tiwala nyo.
Right.
May kasalanan din kami. Here's how we will win back that tiwala. I think that would be such a potent form of political discourse because it would be new. It would then heralded. Ang hinahanap ng Pilipino bago eh. What's newer than an apology in Philippine politics? And a real apology, not, Gloria type apology, I'm sorry.
More a tatay type apology, right? Because I remember, Duterte dung sa kasagsagan ng pandemya, meron yun eh, meron siyang speech yung sabi niya, whiskey daw siya in the middle of the night. Tapos sabi niya, hindi ko alam ang gagawin ko, hindi ko alam kung kaya ko to. Alam mo yung ganun-ganun siya. Tapos parang, oh my God, it works! Like, he makes himself a sympathetic character. Right? Even though parang inis na inis ka eh. Parang ano ba yung kapalpakan tong pandemic man. Suddenly you feel for the guy and you want to be there for him. Right?
Yung binababa mo yung loob mo.
Right.
That's very potent.
Correct.
Alam mo, Richard, yung suggestion ko sa Liberal Party.
Go, Mark.
Dun sa vlog. My suggestion to them was for the Liberal Party, kung whatever is left now, kasi di ba Lenny is independent na, and
Right.
buhay, the Liberal Party should stop being opposition and join the majority. Tapos the opposition should grow from somewhere else. Para kasi pag Liberal Party nandiyan yung mga hindi gusto ng tao kay Pinoy, hindi gusto ng tao doon sa
I
mga
see what
ibang
you're
miyembro
saying.
ng Liberal Party.
Yeah.
So I think that's the best way to move forward, to start over Liberal Party, maybe join the majority, tapos you develop the young talent and and Liberal Party could grow from there na. Tapos you have the opposition use a different one na lang or ano.
Parang purge or case of death, parang yung mga trapo doon sa kabila, o doon na kayo sa admin para wala ng ano.
Hindi din naman nila kasalanan eh. Kasi like you said, 'di ba, Pinoy naman, marami din naman maganda nangyari doon kay Pinoy. It's just the way they were painted eh.
At walang response.
Araw-araw inaatake sila sa social media, hindi sila nakaka-respond ng maayos. So, yun.
Right.
May tanong ako sa inyo, Mark or Richard. Ano yung straw that broke the camel's back in terms of yung amor ng mga tao sa Liberal Party? Was it Mama Sapano?
Mark, ikaw muna. Sige. Ano sa tingin mo?
It's a lot of things eh. Laglag bala. And I mean, it anything eh. Pero I think it's the Duterte magic eh. Tapos Liberal Party is always opposing Duterte. So nahanapan sila ng lahat ng butas nila. Parang ganun eh. Parang I think because yung pag-oppose nila kay Duterte, yun yung main na Duterte was popular. Who would have expected na Duterte would still be popular hanggang sa dulo ng term niya, di ba?
Yeah.
So, plus yung araw-araw na tira sa kanya and yung parang the Liberal Party was never able to shake off yung dilawan tag.
Yeah.
People would always say, gusto ko si Pinoy pero hindi ako dilawan. Parang
Right.
they were able to make dilawan a dirty word.
Yeah, I've in private
doesn't mean anything.
heard Liberal Party politicians, high-ranking Liberal politicians tell me, hindi naman ako dilawan ah.
Diba? What does that mean? It doesn't mean anything. They made up that word eh. Wala naman. So,
Right.
So parang ganun yung 6 years na araw-araw na atake na ganun.
But Mark, going back to what you said, I mean, and also what Lelo was saying, I mean, I noticed with a lot of people who are into this whole dilawan bashing thing, one of the concerns they have is, unang-una, walang mea culpa, which is exactly what Lele was saying. And I keep on hearing this also about opposition in other countries. I remember a Brazilian official told me that's what Lula needs. A mea culpa, he'll do even better than people expect. Right? And I was saying that's perfect for the Philippines. But the other one is yung perception na judgmental. Some of the supporters of Lenny at least. Na they talk down at people. And look at it, when natapos yung elections, they're trying to dismiss the whole thing as disinformation. And for me, I'm a bit suspicious about that. Not because, of course, disinformation is a factor, but parang subliminally you're saying na uto ang lahat ng tao. Parang I don't buy that because you are underestimating frustration, anger, and also the shortcomings of the previous administration. And I want to also add this, Leloy, tama na unfair i-blame lahat sa Aquinos because they only had 12 years in total. But remember, the poster child for the post-Marcos regime were the Aquinos. They were the antithesis of the Marcoses. So everything that happened since the Marcos fell can be attached to the Aquinos. Yeah. The same way that all good things can be attached to them, right?
Because gumawa tayo ng binary, yung
exactly.
reputation ng Marcoses,
exactly.
on the reputation of the Aquinos, balance sila, parang almost zero-sum game.
Exactly. Right. And wala pa tayong strong third force, no? Grace po tried it, Binay tried it, Isko tried it. Hindi pa rin nangyari. For some reason, we're not producing the third wave or third way or third force. I don't know why. We can still debate that. But we're still stuck in that. The only question is, sino mas mabigat ngayon? And this election was really lopsided, no? 2-1 yung ratio. Kasi, I'll be honest, I really didn't think Lenny could win it once nagsama yung dalawang houses, no? But I felt maybe it could be 25 to 20 million. Not 32, 31 to 15 million, right? Medyo...
Kahit sa economic messaging, parang either or, eh. You have
right.
papasok yung investment and I'm strong, I will build a lot of things.
Mahina sila, corrupt sila.
Either or, right?
Yeah.
But I can imagine a situation wherein somebody says, I transcend anti-corruption, naniniwala ako sa social services for the poor, but I have a vision of greatness for the country as well. Kasi magpapatayo din ako ng maraming classroom, magpapatayo din ako ng maraming road. Like, all in. Pwede naman yun eh. But I don't understand why people are locked into these narratives.
Binary.
Either or.
So now let's talk about the inauguration speech of Marcos because a lot of things were happening there. Aside from the Patek Philippe watch and tonguing and all of that. I watch all, so I had to break that live on TV, right? So you can imagine, it's like, paano ka? Okay, so what is your understanding of that? Bakit pinili yung National Museum, the former legislative building? He's only the, fourth president to give a speech there, right? And lahat ng mga lahat ng mga nauna sa kanya ay medyo mga wartime crisis presidents. Was that intentional? Or was it also the glitz, I mean, the neo-colonial white building behind, may pagka-Athenian, I don't know, what do you think? Aesthetics was there, history, symbolism? Why there? Why not in the Quirino Grandstand as per usual?
Diba parang akala ko at one point ginagawa yung Quirino Grandstand or parang,
May hospital pa doon eh.
Sa pandemic.
So,
pero yung ano lang dyan, kailangan based in tradition. So you had Quirino Grandstand or you had the museum.
Right.
You couldn't do it like Duterte style, breaking with tradition, yung
Right.
maliit sa Malacanang lang. So between those three options, doon ka na dun or those two options, kung wala nang foreclose na yung Quirino Grandstand, doon ka na lang sa mas may tradition. Kasi the Marcoses believe in tradition. The Marcoses believe in the kind of accoutrements of state power.
Right. And what do you think about the inauguration speech? There was a lot of English there. The prose was, I think, more targeted towards the dignitaries there. You had the Australian Governor General, the first gentleman of US. You had the Japanese foreign minister, the Chinese right-hand man, Wang Qixian. I mean, it looks like Bongbong was there to remind the world, hey, we're, maybe you thought we're this and that, but come on, we're back and we're back in force. And look at it. I'm not going to do ad-libs. I'm not going to be all over the place, bara-bara. I'm going to give you a clean, nice speech. And my first impression of the speech was, it was an exercise in navigational skills, right? Like, he navigated through all very, contentious issues. He discusses Ukraine, but he doesn't take sides. He discusses kind of West Philippines, he doesn't attack China. He kind of says, don't talk about the past, but kind of medyo may pa-praise siya sa tatay na but doesn't dwell too much. Do you get what I'm saying? Like, sobrang maingat yung gawa. It was a very smooth operation kind of speech. That's how I look at it, yeah.
Even yung manner of speaking, he's
Right.
trying to evoke his father a little bit, but he's not going to orate the way his father orated. Like, he's going to use the booming baritone. But he's not going to do yung old school oration ng ama niya na kung actually pakinggan mo ngayon sobrang baduy na, di ba? Parang if you listen to old tapes of Ferdinand Marcos, he reminds you of a torne compañero, di ba? Yung ganun talagang baduy orator. So hindi na niya ginawa yun.
So medyo may modern twist. Marcos Light nga. Marcos Light nga.
So everything is trying to hint at this possibility of a modern Marcos.
Right.
Everything from the tone, from what he's navigating. And actually, I think in that respect, like it was a good speech. Like, and it was well delivered. But of course, these are just speeches, right? Ang hanapan talaga siya, tatanong talaga ng Pilipino, ano yung gagawin mo? Kasi that's why he was elected, di ba? Dapat may gagawin ka. But the speech hit all the themes that
the
he
right
wanted
notes.
to hit: unity, and also he hit this idea of we don't just want to be a stable country, we want to be a prosperous country. I think he mentioned that prosperity, greatness, di ba? And Filipinos are actually looking for that. That's why, parang si Gideon Lasco as a book, he says the Filipino
is not a small
country, right? That's what Marcos is also trying to say. We should not be a small country, right? Hindi tayo bansa ng tapa lamang. We can be a country that plays a role in terms of foreign policy. We can be a country that plays a role in terms of economic miracles within the region.
Right. What about yung military? Ang dami some are saying parang daming military doon, and some were using the F word, like, ooh, what's this, right? Although nakita ko naman sila Marcos were chill lang. But in fairness naman, tumayo siya when the frontliners came. That's where he tried to show support. But ikaw, how do you see the parade? A lot like jet fighters, jets, like camouflage men, mga ganun. Like, how do you see that? Do you think that was trying to send a message? Strong man?
I'm gonna punt on that, Richard, kasi hindi ko matandaan yung previous inaugurations kung meron bang ganun.
Yun nga parang medyo OTT over the top. Ikaw, Mark, anong basa mo dun sa inauguration? Like, the whole optics, the whole forma, the whole Patek Philippe, all of that. What do you see that? Yung prose niya, medyo, alam mo hindi bata ang gumawa ng speech niya, mga 40s average age at least, no? Parang 40s, 60s, mga ganun. 40 to 60. I cannot imagine a millennial writing that speech, to just be clear about that, right? Ikaw, Mark, yeah.
Hindi, yun nga, yung sa military and sa, was he trying to convey an image kaya na parang,
Yun nga eh.
Then,
Exactly.
ano din, is he trying to go for that look na, kaya may mga military na ganon, na Philippines na, where you cannot push us around.
Right, exactly.
To make this country great again.
Right.
So parang, was he going for that kaya?
Yeah. Kasi I'm asking you, Mark, because I'm sure nakikita mo paano na, I don't want to use the word spin, but what was the coverage of the Marcos BBM vloggers of the event? What were the aspects of it that they emphasized a lot? Ako nakita ko a lot of, andun si ganito, Governor General of Australia, highest level. Andun ang first gentleman. You know, kita ko yan, like they like, I was like, this is so Marcos, Tiffany and Co., right? They want to emphasize the Manhattan, the Paris, the glitz and glamour, right?
Having said that, if I can interject a little.
Go, Leloy.
I'm sure that hurt the son because, you know, the dad got Spiro Agnew. And
Ayan tayo eh.
He got Demhoff.
Ayan tayo, okay. No comment ako dyan. Back to you, Mark. Naughty.
Yun naman yung comment dun sa inauguration. Di ako mas napapansin ko yung yung about sa dad niya na
Right.
yung food security only happened during my father.
He built more infrastructure than anyone else. And then Duterte too, right? Kasi the other thing I noticed with him, he's also very smooth operator when it comes to not openly criticizing Duterte, but saying he's going to be an improvement nonetheless. Diba? I mean, look at the entire speech. What makes it different is all the previous presidents, they will attack the previous president, right? Aquino will attack, Arroyo will attack. Ito hindi eh. Parang constantly saying, okay naman pero ayusin pa natin lalo. May mga konting kulang, pero pwede natin ang galing eh, ang husay ng pagkagawa. Kaya nga, kutob ko yung nagbingay ng speech, nag-work din sa Duterte admin yan eh. You could see na parang there is a conscious effort to make sure to keep the both houses happy. Not to mention, Sarah was just behind him, right? She was just sitting right there, right? Yung may pillar doon, andun si Sarah, di ba? So, this is why this inauguration was special to me, Leloy, because it has been quite a long time. I would say, Ramos, since you had the pro-admin candidate winning a presidential election, right? Since then, purong anti-incumbent ang nananalo eh. So, it's a very different dynamic with this administration. And inauguration, I would say, yeah.
Tapos, pero at the same time, may hints of discontinuity pa rin.
Of course.
Yung pinakamalaking hint of discontinuity dun sa health, di ba? Parang directly sinabi niya, palpak yung response eh. Almost directly.
That's the only time.
Tinatago, di ba? Parang so
Yes.
ang assumption may tinatago yung dating health secretary. Or, which is correct.
Andun naman siya eh. Si Duque, andun naman si Duque. Palakpak siya eh. Maraming yan. Ayaw ko na cyber level tayo. Pauwi ka na, delikado ka. No comment ako ha. Wala pa tayong DOH secretary, ibang klase. You're absolutely right, Leila. That's the only part of his speech where I see quite an open criticism. And then the fact that tumayo siya nung dumating ang frontliners to say, I'm with you 100%, that I'm going to be a president who's going to focus on healthcare. But yes, he also talked a lot about agriculture, food security and energy security. So he's going to be an economic crisis manager president. And that brings to the last part of our episode 40. So far, if you look at it, Lele and Mark, you're free to disagree with me. I mean, this is how I look at it, right? If you look at the cabinet, it's like 30% loyalists, 40% high caliber, technocratic, good people, and then 30% are essentially, standard people, right? Traditional generals in DND, traditional diplomat in charge of DFA, right? So, definitely it passes the grade for me. And I think this is a much better cabinet than, I would say, at least the previous administration, but even perhaps more than that. No,
yung high-level technocrat at saka yung standard na sinabi mo,
Yeah.
may overlapping, may certain level.
Exactly. Yeah. So 70% is pretty solid for me, this cabinet. I quite like it, right? Medyo, of course, late and all. And then, of course, this is it. If you look at it, he already made some big moves early on, right? He didn't give the DND to Sara Duterte. Speaking of discontinuity, right? Which was really show you the boss move. That's how I see it. I got a lot of bashing for that. The other one is Arroyo did not get the Speaker of the House. It went to Martin Romualdez. Then Cynthia also. Like all of these strong women that we thought are gonna overshadow Bongbong, all of them were pushed aside. Kaya nga, in a way, that was the maximalist Marcos I was talking about. Like, you think he's gonna be passive? You think lalaroan lang siya ng mga malalaking ano? That's exactly what didn't happen, right? Immediately, men close to him or he trusted, literally men, right, are now in all key positions of power, right? And then DND goes to a former general who's from Itogon, from Benguet, solid north. At the same time, may Davao background. Boom. And then, for the first time in a very long time, we have, very long time, not even with Aquino, we have a veteran diplomat in charge of DFA, which is a very, very important, diba? Hindi napuntahin kay Ma'am Carlos, right? Ma'am Carlos was placed in National Security Advisor position, right? So I don't know. I mean, I look at it, and then there's Arsenio Balisacan, NEDA chief of Aquino, now back, but Arsenio is from Ilocos Sur. He has been working with Marcos for a very long time. I interviewed him, and he was quite impressed with Marcos. Maybe Marcos didn't graduate from Wharton or Oxford or whatever, but he understands basics of macroeconomics. He's literate, right? And I think Balisacan and a lot of these technocrats feel comfortable to talk to Bongbong about some of these economic issues in the language of technocracy, in fact. So if you look at it, so him putting himself in charge of the Department of Agriculture may look like a populist stunt. Diba sabi na 20 pesos lang gusto niyang rice. But you know, he has good enough people around him, technocrats and all. He has good enough understanding. And I think if he uses, I hate to use this word, political will, let's say political capital in the right way, I don't know. Marcos might even pull off something. And the last thing I want to say here, and that's why I want to get your reaction, is this. Yung veto niya. First day in office, he vetoed some questionable push, diba? Yung bibigyan ng special economic zone, essentially tax break. Yeah, yun sa Clark, diba? Yeah, like first day pa lang, you know which company would have benefited in terms of tax break, no? Kung natuloy yan. Ito yung airport.
Ano yung response ng San Miguel? Because so far,
wala. Muted response. Wala. Muted response. Right.
They're just hoping na it would get repassed again. Or
yeah. Yeah, basta let's not rock the boat. Let's see how we are gonna operate this. So in short, Marcos said, kung malapit kay Duterte, ibang usapan with me. Probably that's the message being sent out there, or could be read. Na I operate with a different ball game. And I like, if you read the yung veto letter niya sa Kongreso, sa Senate, he even cited environmental issues and national security issues because malapit ang Clark sa Subic, right? And mga military bases. I love it. I mean, if I were given the chance, I would have written exactly the same letter, right? So, I don't know. That's interesting.
Rich, tuloy pa rin yung airport, di ba?
Tuloy pa rin, but
just the
yeah,
economic zone lang.
yeah. But probably it's suggesting that they will also make sure hindi ma-undermine national security. And then look at it this way, on foreign policy too, which is really my thing. The first ambassadors he meet are not from China. India, South Korea, Japan, and the U.S. representative. He met 3 U.S. high-level, or talked to 3 U.S. high-level. Biden, the first one to call him among the world leaders. Then he meets the U.S. Chargé d'Affaires. And then he meets personally Wendy Sherman, who assures him, you can visit America, you have sovereign immunity, which is what I've been always saying, right? So I think Marcos will go to the White House next year. That's my bet. Somewhere middle of next year, perhaps he'll be in the White House. So I don't know. I'm looking at this, Leloy. This is not so Duterte light. This looks more like Marcos light, which is have all the big boys on the table. I like it. Let's talk to all of them, right? This is what Marcos did, diba, Leloy? He was good with Soviet Union. He was good with Mao. He was good with US. He juiced them all out for his own interest. And he was active also in West Philippine Sea. So anyway, this is my piece, no? And I got a lot of bashing for it because marami mga Duterte supporters saying, bakit kay Duterte ganyan ka, pero kay Marcos mabait ka? Sabi, no, it's not because I'm Ilocano. I'm just saying, give credit. Ngayon, wala na eh. So let me say my piece and then go ahead. Go attack me, all right?
Here's my fear, and which is also simultaneously my hope.
Right.
That this becomes a successful presidency. Because why do I fear it? I fear it because if this becomes a successful presidency, burado na talaga yung nakaraan, right?
Wala na. Oo.
You're not gonna get any accountability for that. You're not gonna get any of the money back. Expect, the PCGG to be either shot or become a shell of its former self, right? And there's a completely new narrative that takes hold in the center of the Philippines. I hope for it because a successful presidency benefits us all, right? So, ang hirap.
I know what you're saying.
Emotions are at this point.
Mark, do you agree with that? That the problem for some is that he might actually do very well. And so far, he's showing that he can actually do very well if he really wants to put it together, right? He has the team. Ang husay ng team niya eh.
Yun nga, yun din ang inano ko kung in the next 6 years, what will that do in rehabbing yung image ng mga Marcoses for a whole new generation of Filipinos na hindi naniniwala that people power was good, yung Aquino yung masama, yung gano'n. So, yun ang parang nagiging ano ko din tinitingnan ko din kung how much for the next 6 years, lalo na if he is performing well and if he's doing well sa trabaho niya.
So let's go to the last part of this episode. So medyo live tayo on Facebook. So a lot I'm getting here, which is actions speak louder than speeches, whatever, right? And my point is, even the speech is a form of action, right? Because that was clearly the case with Duterte. His speech was a form of charming and the society, right? And getting away with things. So I don't know, for me speech also matters. It's not that they're nothing. And for me, some of his first moves are, including his choices for DFA, DND, not giving it to Sara, etc. I don't think that's just empty gesture. I think it has huge implications. It says a lot about the Marcoses.
The empowerment of Bendiok, as kind of the central figure, as the kind of virata of this administration, is I think also a good sign.
All right. Ikaw, Mark, sa tingin mo, is this papogi lang and then later on the things are gonna come later on? Or you think so far we are getting already indications of where this administration could go? Because I see a lot of skepticism dito sa mga comments.
Ang ganda nung ang ganda nung ni Leloy Parang that's what I'm feeling din. Parang you want him to succeed sa Philippines. Pero yun nga, if he succeeds, the Philippines will mag-iiba talaga yung tingin sa mga And I'm worried din sa mga victims Kasi sila yung
victims of martial law.
They're the ones getting laughed at. So yun ang I share the same emotion.
Do you have a suggestion, like how should the opposition and the victims deal with the successful Marcos, quote unquote?
Wow, ang hirap niyan.
Ang hirap niyan, di ba? Ang hirap niyan.
You want to speak for them because their pain is unique, di ba?
Exactly.
You can empathize, but you really cannot share the pain. So I can only imagine. I was close to it. My parents almost died during the Marcos regime, but I have them. So parang I can't predicate my pain on an imaginary death of my parents during martial law. Iba talaga kung namatayan ka na magulang or kung ikaw mismo na torture ka during the regime. Iba talaga.
Let me preface, when I say successful, I'm talking about economic development, infrastructure. I'm not talking about democratic health, right? I mean, Lelo, the term actually I used here is that the Philippines is most likely going to be a hybrid regime. Something like Malaysia or Hungary, whereby you have elections, but you know who's going to win. There'll be a dominant hegemonic bloc, and then civil society will be circumscribed. Media will be dominated by pro-government oligarchs and proxies. I see that very much. Like, I would give a 60% possibility. Even if wala tayong constitutional change, even without. Forget about if meron constitutional change. So, when I say successful, let me preface what I mean. I'm not saying we're going to be Sweden or Norway. I'm saying we are going to be more like Hungary or Malaysia.
The difference, Richard, between these countries is yung Malaysia, and to a greater extent, of course, Orban's Hungary, is that these are social conservative regimes.
Right. I see what you're saying.
Orban is predicated, is predicated on a socially conservative agenda, like, against gay marriage, for example, against, women's rights. Did you see BBM's Philippine Independence Day message na parang puro gay flags?
That's a very good point. That's a very good point.
And then of course on all social issues, he was the only candidate who said na he was open to abortion for rape and incest. He's pro-gay marriage, he was pro-RH. Ano pa ba? Isa pa yan So, apat yun pro-divorce.
Right.
Diba? Pro-divorce.
What about drugs, recreational drugs? Baka mamaya he'll be much more open. I'm not saying it in judgmental way. I mean,
medicinal.
He's an underground British music aficionado, right? So you don't believe me? Ask Lord De Vera, right? So I'm just saying, right? This guy is a product of liberal British culture, right? He's totally unlike any president we have had. I like that, Leloy. My only response to that is that's why I compare us to Latin America, because that's exactly what Peronismo was all about, right? It's a right-wing kind of populism, but it has left-wing elements to it. He kind of hybridizes it, right? So Peron had labor unions to him. He had all of this, you know what I'm saying, this samba and all of. So my sense is, Marcos, yes, you're right, that the limitation of comparison of us with Malaysia or Hungary is that they're medyo mas clear-cut, yung right and left wing. Well, I think we're more Latin America, as in Peron and some of their populists, who had also this combination of right and left in this more bigger hybrid kind. Because isn't that the case also with Duterte? He's also, look at Davao, the way they deal with the issue of prostitution with and I'm not saying they're the same, but also minority, sexual minority, gender minority. Duterte was actually quote unquote progressive. I would say, for me, the greatest contribution of Duterte was the Bangsamoro, which also shows him he was a cosmopolitan guy, right? So if you want to use that argument, I'll say, in fairness, Duterte was also very quote-unquote liberal or cosmopolitan. I mean, I saw him, I think he sincerely cares for our Muslim brothers and sisters, and I call that his finest hour. So in that sense, I think Marcos is not too unique, because Duterte also had this hybridity.
Yung finest hours ni Duterte is whenever he's talking about the multi-ethnic Philippines.
Exactly.
Yung final
Exactly.
campaign speech
Exactly.
niya, diba?
Exactly.
Meron akong apo na Moro, meron akong
Correct yun.
kamag-anak na Chinese, meron akong ganyan. We are all Filipino.
Right.
Brilliant. That's
Brilliant.
Duterte at his best. No?
Right. Really. And you pointed out, diba, in meeting the avance niya, he used the Islamic term that God is great, and then he explained it to a Catholic crowd that we have the same God, we're both children of Abraham. I mean, it's like, okay, you know what I'm saying? Like, I had this, it was a goosebump moment for me. Like, wow! As in, wow! Like, I mean, maybe our audience do not appreciate it, but, you know, for anyone who studied these Muslim-Christian tensions in our country for the past centuries, that was political courage at its finest, to give it to President Duterte.
You also have to talk about Sara. You have to talk about Sara Duterte.
Who's also LGBT friendly.
Hybrid figure also. This is
Exactly.
a woman who surrounds herself with feminists.
Exactly.
This is a woman who acted like, apparently there was a study na lumabas, the two cities that put up the greatest resistance to the PNP during the war on drugs were Quezon City and Davao City.
Oh, wow.
So pumapalag talaga yung
Civil society
sa National Police.
Yeah.
And diba there's this amazing scene where Sina Duterte wanted to appoint a police chief in Davao, and then she calls Bongo and she says, "Bong, kayo ba ni Digong ang mayor dito?"
Right, yeah. Now we know why she didn't run for the president, because Duterte had other plans, right? I really love it. So let's end the 40 here, and then we'll go to the next episode, discuss about history as chismis, or maybe not, right? So thank you very much, Leloy, for joining us for this. Patikim pa lang yan, ha? So this is officially our first episode na hindi si Pangulong Duterte yung ating Pangulo, right? Right, Mark? So we have officially begun our new era, Project Pilipinas, and episode 40. Thank you very much sa ating mga supporters. Please continue to support us, and also continue to also support my podcast ka rin, di ba, Leloy? You're also launching your podcast.
We're gonna reboot the Basagan ng Trip series sa Rappler, but it's not gonna be a podcast. Watch out for it, Richard. It's gonna be one of our first.
Ayan, medyo may recycle. Mafia kami dito. Nagre-recycle lang kami ng mga products namin. I know. Thank you very much for that. God bless, and join you soon.
Ano sabi sa Facebook? Binabash ba?
Hindi mga tao. Live tayo. There's still people are gonna listen to you. Mag-behave kayo. Don't say anything stupid. Alright? Chismoso kayo. Alam mo, last time si Mark... Hindi. Ang gagawin mo na lang, you cut it na lang in the middle, no? Kasi natakot ako baka magkamali tayo or something. Or you want me to... You cut it na lang.
Stop na sana.
You want me to...
Hindi din magulo.
Sige, I'll put stop recording and then ulitin ko, ha? Okay, let's go. Okay. Eto, may live pa tayo dito. Ito sabi ni Mitch. Yay! Basagan ng trip. Ayan. Sabi ni Florante Cachero, another wonderful insights. Ayan, daming natuwa dito. Ayan tayo. Yung marami tayong fans, yes. We have 700, 800 people watching us live now on Facebook. So, that's pretty decent. It's midnight here in Manila, just to put things into context, bro. So, congratulations. Nasaan ka na, Mark? Magsimula na tayo. Alam mo itong Mark, loko-loko yan. Naka-live tayo na Facebook na ganito. Tapos chinichismis, ano mo yun, si Darian, nasa City Hall yan ng Manila nung election time, ganun. Tapos, yung mommy ko, sabi niya, "Uy, anak, nung lumabas ka, palit ka si Mark Gambon, nilalaglag ka." Sabi ko, wala nga parking doon sa City Hall ng Manila, paano ko tumambay doon, eh? Sirahin natin si Mark ngayon. Anong chismis mo dyan? Leloy. Ayan na. You know, models of Manila. Wait lang, palit na. Lelo, you wanna change your clothes, put the jacket on. Kunyari, ibang episode tayo. Can you, put that, put the bongbong jacket. Let's wear red. Sige, mag-red. Balik lang ako, 1 second, ha.
Yung, kamusta?
Ay, Mark,
Yung mga
umayos
viewers
ka.
ni Richard.
Mark, umayos
Ano
ka.
gusto nyong
Ayan tayo.
Richard?
Ayan tayo, Mark.
Hindi ako naka-live eh.
1 second, ha. Naka-live dito, Mark, ha. Uy, yung mami ko
Kwento ko lang sa mga viewers ni Richard. Nung Sabado, nandun ako sa Angat Buhay HQ.
Uy, ano?
Yun.
Anong ginagawa mo doon, Mark?
Yeah, I wanted to experience it eh. I wanted to, kasi the whole election, syempre, hindi ako pumupunta. I was on a different camp eh.
Correct. So ngayon, anong reception
Tapos
sa'yo?
I was able to meet, anong last name ni Rafa? Sa Angat Buhay.
Sino yung CEO nila?
Tapos nakapagkwentuhan kami saglit. Sinabi ko din naman, na madalas I'm critical sa campings.
Hindi, pero you say it naman from, you say it from a position of, how should I say it, compassion, right? I mean, you don't say it from bad will, You say it from a goodwill point. Ayun, no?
Constructive siguro.
Exactly. Alright, okay. Start na tayo. Live pa rin tayo sa Facebook, ha? Alam niyo na, kunyari lang yan sa mga ibang audience namin, pero kayo alam niyo na yung katotohanan dito. Ano lang to? Ano lang? Low budget lang to. Palit-palit yung mga ganun. Parang Saul Goodman. Alam mo yung Breaking Bad style, yung mga production. Ayan. Yan tayo. Alright, let's start. So, itong episode, guys, let's talk about history as chismis. So, here, Leloy, ikaw magdaldala. Medyo shut up na ako. Kasi ikaw talaga historiador. Okay? We really wanna juice you out on this. Tell us about history. Tell us about chismis. And then, now, balikan na natin yung issue ng victims and all of that. I think this is where we can talk about the other side of this discussion. Alright, let's start.
So yung chismis,
Okay.
ano ba ibig sabihin pag sinabi nating history is chismis? So, iba yung pag sinabi mo, the writing of history.
Sorry. Richard,
Hindi pa ako nag-start. Yes.
Yung hindi tayo naka-record.
Hindi pa. Hindi ko pa na-press kasi I'm waiting for you guys. Okay na tayo? Let's go.
Okay.
I wanna...
So, akala ko start na.
Malinis. No, hindi pa ako nag-start. Okay.
Sorry to cut you off.
Alright, go.
Okay, akala ko
Hindi pa ako
start
nag-start. Go, okay. I have to greet muna people. Walang yake. Hindi pa ako nag-greet. Ayan. Okay. Yan na! Ayan na. Episode 41. Nag-change costume na kami. Ayan. Nilaglag ko na yung sarili ko. Ayan. Ayan si Leloy. Wow, nice jacket, bro. Parang malapit ng Game of Thrones. Ako, medyo I'm channeling my inner Robin Padilla, my co-Baguio boy. Yan. Si Mark naman, back to...
Ateneo Blue.
Ayun, no? Si Mark. Ateneo,
Ateneo Blue.
Ayan, kamusta ka na, Mark? Happy ka na?
Okay naman.
Kamusta Models of Manila? Di ba may basketball team ka na ngayon? Talagang manager ka ngayon.
Basketball team.
Ayan,
Daming gana. Kanina I was with Mayor Vico.
Anong chismis?
Tsaka ako na lang off-air.
Ay!
Yung mga chismis.
Pero off-air dito, pero hindi dito sa Facebook ko. You know? Ayan. Alright, so we will have an episode on Vico. Hopefully, we can even have Vico down the road, right? Right, Mark? Let's get Vico also on our show. Yeah. Para naman, kumbaga, pogies for higher level of discussion. Magawa tayo ng sarili natin, gano'n. Hindi lang pogies for Lenny, di ba? Walang iya. Alright, okay. Game. So today, pag-usapan natin something amusing but also very serious. Itong issue ng historical denialism, which euphemistically is called revisionism, when in fact, I'm sure Lele will explain to you that two are actually very different because you can have legitimate revisionist accounts, right, in historiography or in scholarly studies. And then there's denialism, which is exactly trying to, deny pre-existing or established facts. So we'll discuss that a little bit more. But before we go there, let's talk about this soon-to-be blockbuster, or maybe it might go not, right? Yung made in Malacanang, right? Made as in M-A-I-D, parang made in Manhattan style. Kay Daryl Yap pa to, Mark? Ikaw yung marites sa atin dalawa eh.
Daryl Yap.
Direct Daryl Yap, who's very good in putting himself in headlines a la Tatay Digong. Right, so this Made in Malacanang has been making a lot of rounds over the past week or so for many reasons, but the latest one is one of the child actresses there involved, a role pala ni Irene ang ipi-play niya, di ba? And I'm not gonna engage in bashing the kid because, you know, I don't think she really meant bad. So I'm not gonna get into that, although she got a lot of bashing. Sabi niya, ang history po ay parang chismis, no? So that really triggered a lot of our friends. Ambeth Campo, I think a lot of great historians really responded to that. But today, we have a world-class historian, someone I respect a lot, someone with whom I was not in the best terms back in college, right? For competitive reasons, right? No, we're fine. We used to be colleagues in Ateneo. So, kasama po natin ngayon ang Assistant Professor Dr. Lisandro Claudio, better known as Leloy, joining us from Berkeley, California, before he heads back to the Philippines and discusses things from the ground. Kamusta, Leloy? Thank you for joining us.
Okay naman, nag-impact pa rin bago lumipad sa Pilipinas.
O yung souvenir namin, ha? Yung rubber shoes ko na Adidas, bro. Pag-easy. Ito na naman tayo. Sorry, I'm just kidding. Ayan naman tayo. Ayan, yung rubber shoes ko Adidas, yung ano ba? Baka may sale dyan. Okay, bro, let's discuss this. So, as a historian, first of all, anong una mong physical reaction when you hear people saying, what you do is nothing but just chismis. You're just more articulate and have a PhD, perhaps. That's the only thing makes you more valid.
Well, okay lang naman banatan yung mga historian, okay lang, no skin off my back.
Right.
And truth be told, marami nga naman mga historian of the Philippines na napaka-assured ng version nila of history. There's no room for complexity, right? So, when people say na dapat may konting chismis, you know, the more generous, and I'm being very generous here, the more generous way of thinking about that is you know, a demand for more complexity, a demand to see multiple sides of a narrative. Okay, having said that, how do we think of this chismis issue? I think dapat you make a distinction between yung sources of history and history as written. So, when you're a historian, may sources ka. So, maraming sources ang historian. And usually, yung favorite sources namin are primary sources. Yung things from the period itself. So, for example, if you're studying the 70s, you're looking for sources na galing sa 70s itself. Pwede bang masama yung chismis dun sa sources? And absolutely, right? So, mahilig kami tumingin sa mga diary.
That chismis. Evidential chismis.
So, pag tumingin ka dun sa mga diary at sa mga letter na yun, marami dun nag-gossip, marami dun nag-chismis about other people. And you can actually use that to spice up yung history. And you can use that to reveal yung sentiments sa mga tao, that what they're gossiping about is telling of yung fears, aspirations, and hopes ng mga
and power games, power plays, court intrigues, literally court intrigues.
Diba?
Yeah.
Lalo na yung mga people who are doing histories of, say, kings and
Tudors.
Napakamahalaga ng chismis dahil yung chismis pag naniwala yung mga tao dun sa chismis na yun, they act on it, diba? Kunwari may chismis na this other prince is attempting to steal my throne.
Right.
Whether na totoo or hindi yung chismis, yung hari could act on that. So chismis in that sense is important. Pero yung writing of history should not be chismis kasi chismis is unverified. And when we write history, of course, we need to verify our sources. And we need to write history in such a way na kayang i-verify ng other people yung sources natin. In the same way na, you know, when a scientist conducts an experiment, sinasabi ng scientist, paano ko kinonduct yung experiment na yun so other people can also conduct that experiment and see if it's true, right? For a historian, we should tell others what our sources are so that if somebody wants to check us, pwede nilang balikan yung source na yun. Actually, hindi to ganun ka-common sa Philippines because baboy mag-footnote ang maraming Philippine historians eh. But ideally...
Grabe naman! Pork barrel! Baboy talaga! Okay, kaya gusto ikaw kausapin ko eh. Yeah, go!
Minsan wala. I mean, I love Nick Joaquin but try to...
Ay, wala. Walang footnotes to. Totally ano to. Yan. It's just beside me, Nick Joaquin.
So, as I saw, I try my best na kapag binasa mo yung history ko, gusto mo i-validate yung claim.
Yeah.
Kaya mong hanapin yung source. Kasi ang gagawin ko, ibibigay ko sa iyo yung archive kung saan ko nakuha, ibibigay ko sa iyo yung dokumento, kung merong folder number yung dokumento na ibibigay ko sa yung folder number, at ibibigay ko sa iyo yung page. So kung gusto mong hanapin yung source yourself, kaya mo.
Right. Can you tell us more about that methodology? Kasi parang, I think people know more about archaeology, right? You dig things out, you do you do DNA testing, etc. Then you know if this person is Cleopatra or Caesar or whatever. You historians, you kind of do the same, right? You do archival studies, you interview primary witnesses of an event, you look at the court documents, diaries. Can you tell us about the scientific process by which historians construct or come about evidence as a basis for constructing narratives about a certain period in our history?
Okay, yung term na scientific, as you know, Richard, is very contested, diba? So, maybe I won't use the term scientific.
Methodical. Okay, methodical.
Methodical or methodological.
Yeah.
Or for me, just, my own honest process, diba? So,
Legit.
So for example, now I'm writing a history of currency policy in the Philippines.
Ayun, andyan na tayo.
1900
Away na tayo. Let's go.
1986. So yung una kong gagawin doon is so what I've been doing is I've been going to yung US National Archives sa Maryland. Pupunta ako doon, titignan ko yung index, maghahanap ako, based on yung index maghahanap ako ng folder or box na likely merong ebidensya, may likely merong material dun sa topic na gusto kong aralin. Pupunta ako sa box na yun, magkakalkal ako doon, alam mo yung mga parang nag-uukay. Parang nag-uukay.
Right.
Flip until you find something.
Right.
And when you find something, before, usually, ang gagawin ng mga tao, kukopyahin nila yun by hand, di ba? Or kung pwedeng i-photocopy, pero usually dati bawal i-photocopy, then nadadamage if photocopy nila. Ngayon these days, because you have iPads and iPhones, I just take a picture,
Right.
picture, and then I take note of where I found that. And then when I write, I use those documents to construct my story, and I tell people where I found it,
Right.
so that kung sila mismo gusto lang pumunta sa Maryland, hanapin nila yung sources ko, madali lang hanapin yung sources.
Right.
So, ganun lang naman for
Right.
you. Archival.
So there's a chain of custody, there's a chain of evidence, you give them the basis to verify everything and not.
Pero of course, hindi scientific yun. Kasi, di ba, parang ang daming text nun eh. So, yung pipiliin ko, of course, may element of subjectivity on my part. Hindi may iwasan yun, di ba?
Right.
Kasi hahanapin ko yung mga bits of evidence that I think are important relative to the story I'm going to tell. Because I'm not going to be able to tell you everything that's in the document. Imposible yun, di ba? Kasi the point of writing history is already condensation.
Right.
If you just wanted me to
Synthesis.
tell you everything I found in the documents, hindi photocopy
Right.
ko yun, bibigay ko sa inyo. No need for a historian. The historian is there to interpret these particular texts.
Right. How do you make sure the interpretation is not clouded by undue bias? I mean, this is what keeps on coming up. Kasi that's where Mark comes in, right? Parang, bias rin pala kayo. Di puro tayong bias. I mean, let's go postmodern, right? Your truth is as truth as mine anyway, right? As truthful as mine.
So yung isang tanyag na historiador na German, si Leopold von Ranke, he said that historians should extinguish the self. Patayin mo yung sarili mo. Try to imagine yourself try to imagine a world where you're not there and you're just really representing almost in visual detail the past. I think that's impossible. Hindi pwedeng patayin ang sarili, laging may sarili.
Yeah.
But I think it can be to a certain degree a kind of asymptotic goal. Yung goal na hindi mo na talaga marami.
Na perfectly,
try your
but you
best.
can reach close to it, yeah.
So there are some historians
Yeah.
who try that, diba? As much as possible, I just try to render the document as accurately as possible. But there are historians also who admit that they have a bias. Like, a historian will say, I'm a Marxist historian and I want to represent the history of the
Right.
working class and represent those particular dynamics. I think one of the problems yung sa historical discourse now is that we tend to assume there's one kind of historical writing. Ang dami-dami kong call. I'm not going to write history the way Ambeth writes history. Ambeth's not going to write history the way Vicente Rafael is going to write history,
Right.
or the pro-Marcos historian Reynaldo Ileto is going to write history.
Yeah, I think it's now out, no? Now it's very open na. It's really pro Marcos na, no? Yeah. Ikaw, Mark, do you have a question on this? Kasi, yeah.
How can we avoid na parang history gets used parang for politics or for to win power or to ano? So how do you think we can avoid that? Yung nangyayari ngayon eh.
You can't. I mean, history has always been used for power. Parang claim making, just establishing, for example, monarchies requires history. It requires a record, for example, a genealogical record of saying, ako talaga yung heir of this
Yeah.
particular throne, and I use that for power, right? So history is always part of that process. And kami mga historians, we can't do anything about that. We write, and then people interpret our writings and they use it for certain ends. The best we can do is try to make sure that the process is honest. Now, I think there's a difference between honest and objective. I don't think historians can be objective dahil lagi may pagkiling, lagi may frame of mind. Pero yung honest means, hindi ako nagsisinungaling. Meron akong point of view, but I'm never going to, hindi ako magsisinungaling. Kung sinabi ng dokumento, 20%, sasabihin ko 20%. Kung sinabi ng dokumento, yung value ng peso noong 1918 is whatever, 1 to 2. I'm gonna say that, even if I'm going to interpret it differently from, say,
Right.
maybe a conservative historian.
Right. Lele, going back to this, like, what are the things that we know based on the existing historiography and evidence about the Marcos era that is more or less incontrovertible, no? Kasi we see a lot of pro-Marcos people saying, oh, ano lang yan, we still need more studies, nothing is final, blah, blah, blah. But and then some other people say, in Germany, if you question Holocaust, you go to jail, right? And some are saying, bakit hindi ganun sa Pilipinas, right? So what are the things about the martial law's darkness that perhaps are beyond questioning anymore, or at least we have enough evidence, so much so that even questioning the horrors of that era is how could I say it? It's like against the human spirit, if I could put it that way. But at the same time, Lele, sorry, before going that, there's the other side, and that's why I want to talk about you. What are the things also about the Marcos era that a lot of critics of Marcos are not appreciative of? And I think that's where you come in. And I can call you even revisionist for that, but revisionist in a strictly academic way, right? Because based on evidence, you can say some of the aspects of Marcos' policy were actually reasonable. I do that, for instance, on foreign policy. You can call me revisionist on his foreign policy. But domestic, in terms of human rights violation, etc., I think the evidence is perhaps incontrovertible, right? What is your say on that? Can you please go on to that?
Tama nga, Richard, yung pagnanakaw at saka yung human rights violations, I think incontrovertible yun kasi on the human rights violations, ang dami-daming na-torture nung panahon na yun. And we can talk to them, di ba? Ang dami-daming assassinate nung panahon na yun. And we can talk to yung families of yung victims. And of course, in-affirm na yan ng Philippine Supreme Court that they are victims of martial law and they deserve an element of compensation. Supreme Court ba or Congress actually? Congress
Right.
affirmed it by an act of Congress. And then of course the Supreme Court has affirmed yung pagnanakaw, di ba? Kasi napakalinaw na yung kinita ng mga Marcoses is way above yung declared income nila or income that they could have gotten as officials of the government from 1965 to 1986. Napakalaki ng gap. So those things are not open questions for me.
Settled matter na. Yeah.
Yung open question
Okay, let's
questions
go
for
that.
me is yung economics, yung effects ng policies nila on society, because the standard anti-Marcos narrative is nagnakaw si Marcos, binaon niya tayo sa utang, nasira yung ekonomiya. I think the story is a lot more complex than that, and we've talked about this a lot in our previous podcast. So for example, yung pagbaon sa utang, marami namang other countries na malaki yung utang nung panahon na yun. So the Philippines is not exceptional in that regard. And that's why the 1980s debt crisis is not called the
Philippine debt
La
crisis.
Decada, the lost decade for the Philippines. It's called La Decada Perdida, period. Walang qualification. It's La Decada is a lost decade for most third world countries. Not La Decada Perdida de Filipinas.
Right. Lalo na Mexico, Latin American countries, a lot of them defaulted on that. Can you tell us more about that? Because this is where I think you and I have had healthy back and forth. Because my argument is, I absolutely agree with you. Deficit spending, borrowing to invest, I don't see any problem with that, assuming the money that you borrow actually goes into productive investments, right? Infrastructure, human capital, education. And then the second problem I had is Marcos' administration, and I think my mentor, people like Walden Bailey, have also written on this, is that he did not create a kind of an efficient export-oriented industries, as in neighboring Taiwan or Korea. Because you're absolutely right. Like if you look at Park Chung-hee, you look at a lot of our neighbors, they had dictators, and their dictators also propped up their cronies. But the cronies that they propped up were relatively effective oligarchs who became the Hyundais, LGs of today, right? Where are our Hyundai and LGs? I don't see any of that. I see the debt, the 26 billion left. I don't see the Hyundai and LGs. This is the problem I have. So for me, that's where I see some issues with your argument. Your argument is correct in abstract terms, but when applied to the Marcos administration, it just doesn't qualify as a developmental state to me. It looks more like a
It doesn't-
booty
it doesn't.
capitalist state. Yeah.
It's a crony capitalist state.
Yeah.
Pero yun nga, when the developmental state, when the system of picking winners works, you call it the developmental state. Sabi nga ni Carol Howard.
Aha, okay,
When
I see.
You call it crony capitalism because it's the same thing. So the issue here is not to say that Marcos was a developmental state. The issue here is to say that certain of yung mga economic policy interventions ni Marcos are interventions that we should not give up on. as
Aha,
policy
I see, I see.
because associated siya with the Marcos regime. Of course, we can quibble about yung kind of specifics, right? For example, bakit hindi naging developmental state? Actually, interesting yung si Jerry Sica, who became the NEDA head of Marcos, the first NEDA head actually, founded
Right.
the institution. So he comes in at around 1970, 1971, and he says we're going to do something that's similar to what's happening in Japan.
Right.
But built in na actually yung excuse ni Jerry Sicat when he came in because he already said in the late 60s that we already missed the boat for industrialization in the 50s and in the 60s.
Right.
Kasi hindi natin din-appreciate yung peso
Yeah.
then. So meron tayong periodic balance of payments deficits. So in a way, pagpasok pa lang ni Sicat, sinabi
Yeah,
niya, I'm gonna
okay.
try,
Right.
but I don't think we're going to end up becoming like Japan or Mexico because the fault is with Magsaysay. The fault is with all those-
Makapagal. All the way to Makapagal. I see. And I mean, we had that issue. Diba, Rojas pa lang, he was saying the problems were too import dependent. Parang matagal na problema naman, na parang unfair naman na isisi ito kay Marcos. Let me get to this because let's talk about the virtues, or let's say some of the good intentions that Marcos had, and then for some reason it didn't work, right? Can we talk about that? Because you see, if you look at the data in the 1960s, essentially the Congress was paralyzed. It was barely passing any law, right? The Supreme Court was not moving on key laws that were being questioned, etc. We couldn't raise taxes. May Cold War. So in many ways, a dysfunctional democracy in meron tayo in the 1960s, or liberal oligarchy. And then Marcos comes in. And I could say, isn't it the same thing now? We have had a dysfunctional democracy over the past 3 decades. Then Duterte comes in as a prelude to Marcos, right? It's not like it's not like Marcos was trouble in paradise, to use that term. Because I think that's what a lot of his critics think. Like, things were fine, and then this ambisyoso came from Ilocos with his ambisyoso wife, and then they took over everything. I said, actually, no. The Philippines was in deep troubles. If you look at the actual numbers, it was political paralysis by that time. And then Marcos, being opportunist, pushed for it. But there's one thing, and you can accuse me of being tribalistic about it, is that one thing I always like about the Ilocanos is that they're egalitarian, right? Because the political economy in the North is very different. We have had dry, alam mo yun, paway, etc. We never had it as fertile as the rest of the Philippines. So scarcity was the name of the game in Ilocos. And that created a new political economy, including yung economic, yung very frugal culture namin. But also, it didn't create, so I'm already going to Achimoglu, no? Achimoglu Robinson's institutions, extractivism. And the other thing is that we never had this kind of big haciendero cultures. There's this big haciendero, and then all of us are like his serfs. No, in Ilocos, if you notice, the rich are not super richer than the average ones, and they eat sometimes on the same table. Now, why is that relevant? Because when you talk about the Bagong Lipunan, and I'm very indebted to my former professor, Olivia Kawili of Political Science Department, of the great minds of the Political Science Department, she said, if you look at the conception of Bagong Lipunan, it was very much like, ganito kami sa Ilocos, gusto namin buong Pilipinas ganon, which is also like Duterte. Ganito kami sa Davao, gusto. Do you get what I'm saying? So maybe I'm bringing already a Ilocano perspective. But for me, for a moment, just put aside everything.
Ilocano ba si Professor Kawili?
Yes. So we had that conversation along that way. No, so for me, it makes sense. I think Marcos had some very good intentions along those lines. I also had a lot of conversation with the late Manong Frankie, right? Who is also Ilocano, right? We had discussions about this. And he kind of confirmed also. He talked to Marcos, he talked to Magsaysay, he interviewed all of these people. So I was able to confirm to some people who have had direct interaction with the Marcos regime. Malamang UP rin, di ba? So I don't know. This is one way that I kind of try to be more, I would say, variegated in my analysis of the Marcoses, which is very different from the training I got in Diliman, which is more like, I won't say black and white, but more like red and a little bit of not so red, right?
I
Can
call
you-
it, I call it the Diliman.
You call it Diliman consensus, right? And by the way, I'm so not into this Bonifacio over Rizal thing. I think that's completely nonsense. Rizal was clearly a revolutionary. To be liberal in 19th century means revolution, right? Because we were just a colony. But going back to that, and I want to bring in Mark also here now, because Mark has been very, very perceptive when it comes to shifting moods online, when it comes to martial law, etc. But let's talk about this, Leloy, because the last time we had a podcast, maraming natuwa sa podcast natin because they said even if some of us are more openly for certain side, meaning anti-Marcos, we have been giving credit where credit is due, or try to at least have a more variegated view of history. Now, I want to get your perspective. Can you come in, Leloy, and tell me more about this? I just gave my own 2 cents on what I see as complexity when it comes to the Marcos regime. Now, what is your version of complexity under Marcos?
Ideologically, Richard, I'm going to say something similar, which is on a national level, let's not forget that democratic revolution from the center as a concept makes sense, di ba? Because yung argument ng democratic revolution from the center is that meron kang dalawang problema sa lipunan. On the one hand, you have the problem of the extreme left, which is which has totalitarian impulses and which actually drinks from the well of totalitarian countries.
Stalinist,
China,
Maoist,
and the
yeah.
Soviet Union, Stalinism, right?
Correct.
And on the right, you have the problem of the oligarchs.
Right.
So what you need to do is to wage a democratic revolution from the center
Right.
that will unite people against these two extremes.
Mm.
That's brilliant, di ba?
Right.
If you tell me today, would I sign up for ideology like that? I'd ask you, sino who's heading that ideology? But I'm not going to say no immediately because
Right.
conceptually it makes sense.
Correct. Very good, very good point.
So,
Yeah.
so yung ideas na yung coming from Marcos, from Marcos are brilliant ideas. So, but it's all the problem with Marcos is always ang laki ng gap between the ideas and the execution, right? So
Why? Why do you think? Because they were too corrupt. There were new rich people who made it to power and lost themselves. What happened? Where do you think it went wrong? Was the worm in the apple to begin with? Was it at the core of the project itself, or somewhere along the way something went off the tracks, off the rails? Yeah.
I don't know how to answer that because it's partly also yung psychology ni Marcos himself.
Right.
Diba? And it's so difficult to psychologize the guy because he was so inscrutable. And even his diaries where supposedly parang you get a more private Marcos, he's writing those diaries
For us.
posterity.
Yeah, exactly.
So, kausap na niya tayo dun
Yeah.
He's already one step ahead of us.
Yeah. Exactly.
So we don't know where the corruption comes in, but definitely I think there's always an element of cordon sanitaire and absolute power corrupts
Absolutely. Yeah.
right? So if you listen to Marcos in the 60s, he's actually a lot more voluble, a lot more intelligent. By the time you get to yung kanyang William Buckley interview in the middle of martial law by 75, 76, he's so sold on his own propaganda and his own PR.
He drank his own Kool-Aid.
He's not even intelligent anymore, right?
Yeah.
Because power actually makes you dumb because nobody's gonna challenge you, and if nobody's challenging you, yung kind of mental flexibility mo nawawala, and you resort to kind of peons and PR statements. And I recommend people watch that William Buckley interviews on YouTube with Marcos. Wala siyang ginawa kundi mag-orate, wala siyang ginawa kundi balikan yung kanyang mga motherhood statements. Towards the end, actually, lumalabas yung old intelligent Marcos where he talks about his independent foreign policy with China.
Yes.
You see the old Marcos brilliance.
Right.
Yung middle, mga 25 minutes, you'll see Marcos at his worst.
Yeah.
And I think it's because parang nobody's challenging him anymore. Everybody's just saying, you're right, Mr. President. You're
Pero,
the boss. Apple Lakay ka na.
Lelo, di ba?
So when he becomes Apple Lakay, that's, I think, when some of, at least the intelligence starts to fade.
What about yung sickness niya? I mean, one thing I get maybe a lot from my fellow Ilocanos is that, he got sick, so maybe that affected also his ability to execute his plans. Or maybe...
Yung pinapanood ko nga yung video niya, doon pa lang, parang mid-7, ubo siya ng ubo doon I don't know.
That's my point Parang there was already a physical aspect to this decline
yung physical. And also yung control, di ba? A lot of people are saying, like even a lot of the technocrats were saying, so if you look at the memoirs of the technocrats who become slightly critical, they say it was really in the late 70s, early 80s where everything starts to slip
Yeah.
because everybody's starting to see na medyo mahina na yung
Yeah.
the old man starting to weaken, and everybody's trying to angle to be his replacement.
Yeah.
So as opposed to, running a government, it becomes a competition among the various factions within the Marcos regime as to who's going to take over. And then of course, ang daming interesting rumors flying around from that period up to and including the belief on some people's parts. And actually, I realized that the British Embassy, I was looking at the secret files of the British Embassy, even the British Embassy believed this, that Marcos could give the reins of power to Ninoy Aquino because he was his brad in Upsilon.
Oh,
And
wow.
He actually tested the intelligence of Ninoy Aquino.
So, and in a way, he was a patriot?
That was a possibility, Richard.
So he was a patriot in a sense that he realized that a smart guy should succeed him to keep the house together. Hindi lang. Kasi I'm sure it's not only the fact that Brad, because Nino Aquino was a brilliant guy too, right? This was an interesting, yeah.
So this is not something we can verify. So parang rumors were circulating at that time na yung gawin niya.
Yeah.
And then the British Embassy said also there are rumors. And I think the British Embassy is saying believable rumors, but they're not sure either.
Yeah.
So we don't know. But definitely that possibility was
Yeah.
there. So
I'll bring Mark.
Okay, I don't know how to read that
Yeah.
because we can't interview.
I'll bring Mark in shortly, but just before that, Mark, I want to also get your point on this. My thinking is that's the problem with dictatorship, right? Everything is really up in the air. You don't, because there's no succession plan, right? Unlike democracies, may election, may nanalo, may peaceful transition. Kaya sabi ko yun ang kagandahan ng demokrasya. Sa dictatorship, it depends on the mood of the day, or kung bilang patay na yung hari, wala na, diba? Ang gulo ng sistema, nag-aaway-aaway yung mga faction, diba? But going back to you, kaya nga, for me, Leloy, I think even Marcos was not clear, was not sure what was the plan. He was really wavering, right? Until the end, he was not clear. He was not sure what to do. Kasi sobrang sabog yung system eh. But Mark, tell us your take on this. Ikaw, anong intindi mo sa the Marcos legacy and the 50 shades of dilemmas and tragedies and hopes and aspirations of that era? Because this is 21 years of our national life. It's not 1 year, it's not 4 years. Can you imagine 21 years? Ang dami nangyari nun. You cannot just reduce it to one thing or the other, right?
Yun nga ang concern ko. Ang gusto ko lang din itanong. Kasi yung sa panahon ngayon, how do we teach yung proper history sa kabataan natin, sa kahit di nga kabataan, to our fellow Filipinos din eh. Lalo ngayon that Bongbong Marcos is in Malacanang. Prof. Leloy, how do you think, what is the right way how do we teach yung tamang history to our fellow Filipinos? Parang hindi mo na aasahan ngayon sa school or sa
Well,
parang
actually, ay interesting yung sa schools ngayon, di ba? Kasi one of the reasons bakit nakapasok yung pro-Marcos discourse sa schools is because decentralized yung textbooks. And that's largely because si Cory Aquino allowed for the decentralizations of the textbook. There's kind of ultra-liberalism there.
Right.
But on the one hand, that's also our entry point now. Kasi I think decentralized pa rin yung textbooks. So meron ka pa rin the textbook wars can still continue. So what made Marcos is also what you will use to challenge Marcos in that sense, yung diversity of textbooks, unless of course they start to rein in textbook production, in which case may problema tayo. But
Red tagging kasi pwede niya red tag eh. They can red tag na ngayon eh. Yun ang problema.
Pwede niya red tag eh.
Yeah, yun ang problema ngayon. And then you have a Duterte in charge of Department of Education. Come on, diba? Sabi ko, yeah.
What can you use as parang kunyari if a netizen wants to know the truth about kunyari Coco Levy funds, or they want to know the truth about yung mga crony capitalism, anong pwede nilang source? Saan sila pwedeng pumunta? How can they know itong history na based on, of course, yung based on magawa ng historians and kasi parang ngayon I'm not sure din eh.
Well, you're not sure. So I think yung solution talaga dito is not just to approach students and say ito yung totoo about the Marcos regime, kasi mahirap na because they're going to clam up.
Right.
Lalo na kung Marcos na sila. What you do is you teach them critical thinking skills and hope that they can use that to hope they'll apply that to other things. So you can look at this on a very micro level. For example, fake news. How do you combat fake news? Apparently, hindi gumagana yung anti-fake news education kung gumamit ka ng example that is not neutral. So for example, you're trying to teach someone na pro-Duterte how to spot fake news. Tapos yung ginamit mo na fake news to teach, and I'm guilty of this because I used this in one of my textbooks. Yung
Right.
ginamit mo na example is, somebody says Duterte is the best president in the solar system. Why is this fake news? Simply by virtue of using that example, may hirapan na yung pro-Duterte na tanggapin yung critical thinking message that's
Aha.
embedded.
Because judgmental na siya. Para may pagka-judgmental.
But if you use the neutral example, mas likely nilang ma-absorb yung critical thinking skills, and then sila na yung bahala to apply it elsewhere. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why civics becomes important, because in civics, non-partisan civics becomes important.
Right.
That's one of my projects. Actually, I wanted to say, Richard, I didn't mean to plagiarize the name of your show, pero I realized na halos pareho yung pangalan ng show natin kasi yung Proyekto Pilipino.
Ayan tayo eh. Let me call my lawyers. Ayan na. Gising na, gising na. May kakasuhan tayo.
My civic show with Carlos Santiago, Father Tito.
Ayan tayo eh.
We're non-partisan there. We don't use contemporary examples. We use examples from the past, so that hindi maging defensive yung mga viewers namin. Pero hopefully, makarga nila yung critical thinking
Right.
skills so that they can make their minds up on their own.
Right.
Pero yung isang Filipinos ba, do they even want to have parang critical thinking? Yung iba kasi, parang even if they know na it's fake news, if it helps their argument,
Yeah.
they would still use
Makes them
it.
feel good, right?
Yeah.
Confirmation
Pero
bias.
Kailangan ma-inoculate ng maaga. That's why you have to start early. And to be fair, yung educational system na, and this is one of the things we should really credit the Aquino administration for. It's a skills-based, critical thinking basic education system. Yun yung K-12. So when we talk about K-12, we're just talking about yung 2 years na inadon. But actually, yung methodology nung teaching
Kay Brother
was
Armin.
fundamentally
Yeah.
reoriented under the Aquino administration. And hindi yan basta-basta pwedeng pakialaman ng new administration for the simple reason that it's very, very hard to come up with a new comprehensive curriculum. Now, if they have the time and the money and the energy to do that, go ahead.
Yeah.
But I don't see any reason for them to change it, because even if you change the history parts, for example, worst case scenario, you change the history parts, solid pa rin yung critical thinking outline ng educational system under Pinoy. So that might be one of the last gifts that the Aquinos have given us, itong kind of K-12 system, which really focuses more on critical thinking and skills-based education.
Ito, may sinasabi ni Enif Ledesma, like teach students yung if-then analysis, right? If this is your premise, this should be the argument, this should be conclusion. Like, teach them how to how to navigate and sift through the internet, teach them how to come up with good arguments. Essentially, don't tell them how to paint, don't tell them what to paint, teach them how to paint, right? If I'm going to use that analogy, right? Yeah.
Tsaka for yung a good analogy here, for example, is sa martial arts. Sa martial arts, you learn the concepts.
Right.
Kung martial arts ka. But then you test those concepts through competition and through
Right.
sparring.
And you create your own combinations. Yeah.
An equivalent nun for critical thinking, it's a debate competition.
Right.
I think people should I
Right.
think a lot more people should learn debating as a venue through which you test your critical thinking skills. And I know it was very
Hindi ba ganun yung ginagawa nila sa comment section, Richard?
Ayan nga eh, bardagulan eh. Hindi bardagulan ang gusto ng Pinoy eh. Alam mo, Leloy, I'll tell you about this. Dati, dun sa debate society sa UP, may time na pinapuntahan kami sa mga dorm. Magde-debate kami sa dorm in front of all those people. Alam mo yung ginagawa ng tao? Hindi rin. Ginaganon nila kami. Binabardagulan kami. Hindi sila natutuwa. Wala, hindi rin. Bola lang yan. Gumaganon sila sa amin eh. Tama yan si ni Mark, baka ayaw ng tao ng ganyan.
Oo, yung debate nila, gusto nila bardagulan.
Bardagulan gusto nila eh.
Kaya ako medyo chaotic ako dito. You just need to keep modeling it, like yung if sa mga viewers natin or listeners natin na hindi pa nakapanood ng debate competition, yung mga debaters, di ba? Kulang na magsigawan sila.
Right.
That's bad manner kung magsigawan ka.
Yeah.
Pero may iwasan, may iba nagsisigawan.
Yeah.
But at the end of the debate, people will shake each
Yeah.
other's
Yeah,
hands
tama
and say,
yan.
good
Parang kami
job.
ni Leloy. Mabait kami kahit ano. Sige.
Most of my best friends and the people I respect, like you, Richard,
Yeah.
we've had intense disagreements, in debates.
In that moment lang, yeah.
And we became better friends because we
Yeah.
earned each other's respect through that process,
Right,
right? And
exactly.
until now, some of my most cherished friendships are friendships that were built on these close to screaming matches of
Yeah.
Philippine debating. So I'm not gonna stop modeling that. We should keep modeling that, and that should be part of everyone's curriculum. Yung just the basic insight that hindi pag-aaway ang pagtatalo o hindi pag-aaway ang
Siguro kung magagamit ko yan ngayon, Richard, that's why I'm friends with all the vloggers from all camps. Even the ones na critical of me or binabash ako, karamihan sa kanila friends ko.
Balimbing ka eh.
Ibig sabihin, nagtatalo
Balimbing
tayo.
ka, Mark. Balimbing ka. Balimbing.
Yun ba?
Ayan tayo eh. Ayan
Diba,
tayo.
I'm friends with Sangkay Janjan, I'm friends with Banat Bay.
With Haydarian. With Haydarian. Ayan tayo eh.
Lambo Talabong. Oh.
Walang yaka.
Alam mo, I must admit na parang nahihirapan akong panuorin siya because si Thinking Pinoy, because marami na siyang ininsulto na kaibigan ko, marami na siyang kahit nanay, sarili kong nanay na insulto na niya. And so I really get tested whenever I watch him, but my God, yung explanation niya for sovereign debt, meron siya isang blog on sovereign debt, it's like one of the best explanations for Philippine sovereign debt I've heard.
Eh, syempre, debate society yan eh. Sa amin galing yan. Org namin yun eh.
I highly recommend just that one episode.
Yeah.
Pero just the fact na kaya kong sabihin yun kahit na may sakit, I think it still speaks to my debate training.
Yeah.
Pero that's a good point din, Prof. Leloy. How do historians keep up?
Yeah, good point.
Thinking Pinoy. Na who has a larger platform, who has a larger, we're not saying na mali lahat ng sinasabi ni Thinking Pinoy, pero syempre, yun nga, merong mga points siya na historians would disagree. So, how do historians keep up with people like Thinking Pinoy? That's a big
Well, kasi for one thing, I must, and this is not to, this is a little bit of a fun. Iba naman talaga yung trabaho. I don't need to keep up with him because hindi yun yung trabaho.
Ayan na. Fire shot. Yeah. Ayan.
Ang trabaho, I'm not a blogger, I'm not a propagandist, and I don't mean propagandist in a negative sense. There are really people who work for political causes and they engage in propaganda.
Lobbyists.
That's not me, di ba? I write long academic works that nobody will read, and then
kami naman.
one person will read it and then will condense it into something else, right? And then I try to apply that in the classroom. So our goal is maybe not to keep up all the time. Our goal is sometimes to come in and out of that conversation, right? And I think that's what Richard does, for example. It's in and out of that conversation, but he'll also write longer books that keep him grounded in kind of broader conversations and broader academic literature, so that pag pumasok siya doon, mas may heft yung ginagawa niya. I think that's the best we can do, is to move in and out of these spaces.
And thanks to Mark for forcing me to get into this other world, right? So I used to wear 2 hats, now I have 5 hats, right? So this is what we do. And hopefully, Leloy, we'll see more of you, more of your blogging and podcast. Congratulations. Can you tell again to our audience what is your new rebooted podcast, but so that people can hear more about you? Many people are excited to hear from you, by the way.
So yung Basagan ng Trip is usually it was a vlog show nung nasa Pilipinas pa ako, nung nasa Lasal na ako. Hindi ko na kaya mag-vlog in a studio because I'm based in the US. So but I wanted to continue.
Podcast.
So finally I'm converting it into a podcast. So hopefully it should be available through, your podcast, whatever podcast service you use, it should be available.
So Basagan ng Trip, all right, by Leloy Claudio, right? Leloy, hindi Lisandro.
On Rappler.
Yan. So on Rappler yan. So so yan kung gusto niyo naman ng bardagulan, meron din version yan. Pangalan pa lang Basagan ng Trip, di ba? Ayan. And you had a book, by the way, right? Parang pang 7-Eleven book.
Named after my book.
Alam mo, inggit ako sa'yo yan. Wala pa akong ganyan, Leloy. Yung parang gusto ko yung mga book na mahirap maging pogi. Yung mga ganon book, yung mga ganon klase. Gusto ko ng ganon, pero may paglaban ako sa'yo. At saka Bautista ba yan? Ramon Bautista ba yan? Di ba may ganon siya? Wala pa akong 7-Eleven book So I'll work on that. That will be hopefully our Mark, gawa tayo ng ganyan mga 7-Eleven style, mga basagan din ng trip. Thank you very much, Dr. Lisandro Claudio, otherwise known as Leloy, for joining us. This was really challenging conversation. I hope people do not misunderstand some of the laughters and all we have. We are 100% serious. These are difficult times for intellectuals, for vloggers. Although si Mark, most likely he'll end up in Malacanang soon as a vlogger union member. Pero kami ni Leloy will have to struggle through this. Another 6 years of interesting times, diba? So sabi nga nila, baka we're now jumping from the fire to the frying pan. So perhaps this is more manageable. And let's see what we can do. Maraming salamat, Dr. Claudio, for joining us and hope to join you soon in your programs and also have you more as we analyze the Marcos 2.0 era.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ayan, tapos na tayo. So,
Ayaw
wait,
mo pa ba, Richard?
live pa rin tayo dito. Once again. Guys, off ko kayo. Balikan ko kayo kasi mag-ano naman kami ni Leloy. Mag-back and forth naman kayo. Alright?
Ayaw mo pa, Richard? Or baka kung puyat ka na?
Di, okay lang. Let's do it. Tapusin. Yeah.
Sige.
Kasi baka mamaya yung schedule na naman issue natin. Ha? So, you wanna send me a... Paano to? You'll send me a Zoom link?
I'm gonna send you the link to mine now.
Oo. So, out ko na to. Thank you so much, Mark.
Thank you.
Oo,
Thank you
tapos
so much, bro.
mag-usap din kayo, Leloy. Vlogger world naman. Oh.
Okay.
Richard, tingnan mo sa live mo, may mga tanong sila. Sino daw yung crush mo?
Ayan tayo eh. Ayan tayo.
Ang haba nung thread, hanapin mo na lang.
Ayan, ang dami mga chismosa,
Kaya
Marites
ako
din.
nadidistract kanina.
Ayan
Kasi
tayo.
pinagchichismisan ka ng ano mo, ng viewers mo.
Ayan tayo, walang ya.
Bye-bye.
Basagan ng trip ng mga to, 1 a.m. na. Alright, see you bro. Talk to you soon. God bless.
Yan ang link, Richard,
Ah,
Yeah.
I'll end this now. Oh, ayan. Diyan ba kayo? Ayan, mag-usap naman kami ni Leloy ngayon, guys. Kamusta naman kayo dyan? Let me get the link from Leloy. Second. Oh, we'll do one more, guys. Ito, back and forth kami. Doon naman sa podcast ni Leloy. Talagang off-stage tayo lahat dito, guys. Okay. Sige, magtanong lang kayo Itanong ko dun sa iba. Ano sabi ni Mark? Sinong, why keep up? Okay. Kay thinking, Charva. Ayan tayo. Sige, Mark, awayin mo na yung mga nandun para meron tayong bardagulan. Sige lang. Ayan tayo Ayan tayo. Okay. Ayan. Do you want to make it side by side, bro?
Bakit ka giyan?
I'm using my colleagues. Dun sa
Okay.
Zoom ko, yeah.
Sige, okay lang. I'm gonna hit record.
Sorry.
Hindi ka na magpuwet. Let's try to hit 45 minutes. And
Sure,
I
let
want
me-
to talk about the Philippines from an international lens, but it's
Aha.
not just foreign policy, but
Of
also
course.
how you locate the Philippines relative to other countries, how you compare the Philippines to what's happening.
Yeah,
Diba?
comparative,
Fine.
which is my thing. Okay.
But we'll begin with some straightforward foreign affairs questions.
Yeah. Let me just have some Berok. Pucardi. I'm the most sober writer there. I have energy drink as my coffee. All right. Let's go. Good one, bro. It's good.
Okay.
Many want to hear from you also, so it's good that you're launching this.
Game na. I'll hit record.
All right. Let's go.
Recording in progress.
Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to another episode of Basagan ng Trip. Ako si Leonard Claudio. I'm your host. And today, ang guest natin is another person I think who needs no introduction. He's a writer, he's an academic, he's a professor. You see him a lot on TV, you see him in the newspapers, not just local but also international. A good friend of mine, dekada na kami magkaibigan, ito si Richard Hidarian. Welcome to Basagan ng Trip, Richard.
Salamat, bro. Ayan, tumanda na tayo. Nag-uusap pa rin tayo. But
So, ang gusto ko sana pag-usapan ngayon is the Philippines from an international lens. And what I mean by that is not just Philippine foreign policy, but looking at
Right.
the Philippines relative to other countries and locating the Philippines in the politics of the world. Pero yaman lamang na basagan ng trip yung pangalan ng show
Right.
and lagi tayo may binabasag na trip. Richard, in terms of foreign policy or thinking about Philippines in the world, anong trip na about the Philippines na gusto mo talagang basagin? Yung parang misconception about Philippines na gusto mo basagin.
Yeah, I mean, I know a friend of ours has a book on this, right? And actually, I use the same title also for some of my articles. One of the things I hate hearing whenever we discuss our own country or other countries, other folks discuss us, is that we're a small country. We're not a small country. I mean, we have close to 120 million people, right? So it's a top 20 tayo in the world in terms of population. We're in the top 40 in terms of GDP nominal. GDP PPP, we're I think top 25 by some estimates. So the Philippines can be a credible and legitimate middle power. Kind of something like Indonesia or Australia or even Canada. I think in the distant future, in not so distant future, if we get the right leadership, if we have that sense of confidence. So, kasi ito yung point ko, we always try to look at ourselves as underdog. Look at how we watch, for instance, yung mga Gilas Pilipinas game. We forget the fact that we're one of the strongest teams in Asia, right? We're in the top 5. But
Hindi lakas puso eh.
purong
parang
puso
laging
eh. Hindi husay eh, purong puso. And we see that in politics also, some camps tend to, kaya I always make it feel fun na hindi pwede purong puso lang ang Gilas. Kailangan ng diskarte, kailangan ng height, di ba? Physicality and strength, di ba? So I think we have been stuck in this parang self-victimhood, this kind of we're always underdog kind of mindset. When in fact, I think we can be quite influential internationally in terms of geopolitics, in terms of economics, right? So that's one thing that really annoys me whenever I say, "Oh, we're a small country, dapat ganito tayo, dapat ganyan." Kaya nga, one of the things you appreciate about the Marcoses, right? There are many things not to appreciate about them, and you have also pointed that out. Is this sense of ambition of being more than the let's say the little brown brothers of the Americans, right? That kind of that whole let's say discourse. So I think that's one thing that I really don't like. The other thing that I keep on hearing about the Philippines throughout the years, I don't know. It's that ito iritang-irita ako dito, Lelo. Yung Filipinos want celebrities in their politics, or Filipinos they don't take their politics serious. And I said, like, wait, what? An American is telling me that? Like, hello, your president, this is Trump time era, like he never served in any political office in the past, and then now how dare you to judge the Philippines for being a celebrity obsessed democracy or something like that.
Presidente natin, yung showbiz president natin si Erap, nag-mayor, nag-senator.
Yeah, he went through the process, right? He climbed the ranks. Unlike Trump, who was a reality show guy, we don't even know if he's a billionaire or not. Many people believe that he were brilliant because the president. So if you want to, pull that thing on us, I'm sorry. Like your countries are just as colorful as ours when it comes to that. So there are many, I think, Orientalists portrayals of the Philippines that really annoys me when we have the discussion of the Philippines. People forget that Manny Pacquiao barely got few million votes, right? He's the biggest celebrity that perhaps the Philippines has produced. So what does it say about us, right? And not to mention Cesar Montano, Richard Gomez, a lot of the celebrities didn't make it. So maybe you want to emphasize Robin Padilla, and I'm channeling my Robin Padilla Porma now. But we forget about a lot of the celebrities who didn't make it to the top offices. And a lot of not so, Lenny Robredo was unknown commodity back in 2015. By 2016, she becomes the vice president. And like,
Si Rapi Tulfo, open question kung artista ba siya or hindi, or celebrity ba siya, di ba? Kasi you can say na public service yung trabaho niya beforehand.
Right. No, he's kind of like Rush Limbaugh of the Philippines. I look at him that way. So he's this kind of conservative pundit, law and order guy. And he's a phenomenon. I think the Tulfos are a phenomenon. They have been a big force in the Philippines. And since Duterte, they have been much more mainstream. And now they're in top offices of the government, whether in the cabinet or in the Senate. All right, anyways. Basta my point is, I really like that. Thank you for that question. So, basagan natin ang trip ng mga tao. Yes, we're not a small country. And no, we're not the only celebrity-obsessed country. I'm sorry, look at your own presidents before judging us.
Balikan natin yung una since trip ng mga Pilipino yung binabasag natin sa show na to. Tagalog tayo, hindi naman natin binabasag yung trip ng mga puti. Yung idea lagi na parang ang hina ng Pilipinas, and also yung if something bad happens to the Philippines, it's a lot worse than whatever is happening elsewhere.
Right, correct.
I'm gonna talk about debt now, di ba? We're at 60+% debt to GDP ratio, and the media says that the debt is ballooning. And yet, if you look at the debt to GDP ratio of Singapore, it's 128%.
Right.
If you look at the debt to GDP ratio of what's this, Austria, it's 70%. Of Albania, it's 67. Of Morocco, it's 64. And yet, I'm not. I don't think the media is talking about the debts of these countries as if it's ballooning, as if it's going to fall off a cliff already. And yet, because it's the Philippines, it's so bad, it's so crappy. Dahil Pilipino tayo. So, masyado talagang, in a way, masyadong negative yung Pilipino. So, if somebody comes in and says, okay, Philippine greatness, benta sa atin yan. Which brings me to, what I really want to talk about today, which is the prospects of foreign policy under Marcos. Nabanggit mo na nga kanina, one of the interesting things about Marcos is they're trying to negotiate. They like this image of the Philippines as a player in the international sense. Now, Richard, to what extent is that fantasy and to what extent is that possible reality?
Actually, ngayon, lalo na, I just realized now, mahirap pala kung yung host mo madaldal rin. Like, apparently, this is how you feel when I interview. So like, yeah, daming free-facing, no? Yeah, so let me start from the very beginning here. Let me first of all say this. I mean, you coined this term, you call this Filipino exceptionalism, right? I really love it because that's true. If you talk to a lot of Filipinos, like they think that Pilipinas lang ganito, tayo lang pasaway, tayo lang ganito. And I say, I mean, it's super annoying, Lelo, when I go into a meeting and then the first thing they show is, this is the traffic rules in the Philippines, this is how people drive. And then I say, just go to YouTube and type Delhi or Mumbai traffic, and then you will have an idea of how bad their traffic is. Like, do you know what you're talking about? Because the problem with us as Filipinos is that we only know our country and then we compare it, we only compare our country to developed countries. We don't compare our country to other developing countries or less developed countries.
To Singapore.
Exactly. At meron pa tayo yung what tinatawag ko na Singapore envy, right? Parang walang ganyan sa Singapore, right? Like everyone in the Philippines wants to be Singapore. Lee Kuan Yew is the most cited political figure in the Philippines. Not Duterte, not Marcos, not Pinoy. Lee Kuan Yew, both sides. Both anti-Duterte, pro-Duterte, everyone is citing Lee Kuan Yew. No? I cite Lee Kuan Yew on Marcos, for instance. Now, obviously, going back to this debt and foreign policy issue, we're not Sri Lanka. In fact, Leloy, I've been saying year after year after year, forget about debt trap. Because the Philippines is not even getting much of an investment and utang to begin with, right? Everyone's keep on saying, malubog tayo sa utang, magiging Sri Lanka tayo. Sabi ko, where is the money? In fact, my term for that, Lelo, is pledge trap. Nauto lang tayo ng mga Chino. Sabi niya, mag-invest kami ng 24 billion dyan. Si Tatay Digong naman, no offense to him, ilang bansa bang nabisita niya aside from China nung hindi pa siya presidente, di ba? In the past, 10 years. Parang Taiwan, China lang, di ba? So he was taken for a ride by the Chinese. That was very, very clear. Not much investments came in. So if you look at the Philippines, our fiscal situation has not been too bad for a number of reasons. And one of those reasons is that we're really not getting much of an investments and not much of, you know what I'm saying? So by default, wala tayong problema masyado. Kasi mga kapitbahay natin, Malaysia, ang laki ng investment nakuha nila sa China. But under questionable circumstances. Kaya nga, nagkaroon ng debt crisis issue under the Mahathir administration. And as you may know, I interviewed Prime Minister Mahathir even on that issue of debt. But in the Philippines, I always felt that was not an issue. Now, going to the issue of debt, ganito kasi, Lelo, I mean, I know your stance is, let's put things into perspective. Obviously, we're not Greece, 200% of the GDP. We're not Japan. We're not Sri Lanka. But the first thing you have to keep... Singapore, right? But the first thing you have to keep in mind is you have to make a distinction between foreign debt and domestic debt, right? Because in Japan, for instance, the ratio is very high, but most of it is domestic debt. So it's Japanese people, right, lending money to their government. So that's very different from, let's say, Sri Lanka or Greece, who were borrowing money from foreign creditors. That's number one. The second thing to keep in mind, Lelo, is foreign credit under what conditions, right? Because it's one thing you get a 3% interest rate or 4% interest rate. It's another thing you get 1% interest rate or 2% interest rate. So for instance, Japan, when they invest, sometimes they give you 1% interest rate. Very, very concessional loans, right? China gives more like market rates, 3%, 4%. Then the third level, of course, Lelo, is does the investment comes with strings attached? Or some questionable provision. For instance, Justice Carpio talk about national patrimony provision na kumbaga kung mag-default tayo dun sa debt ng China, dadalhin tayo sa Chinese court at pwede sila let's say, sequester ng ating strategic assets, right? So that's my point. You're absolutely right, Lelo. When it comes to debt, the problem with us is that we don't deconstruct it. We just say high debt is bad, low debt is it. But the other thing, of course, we have to also keep in mind, Leloy, is that, you see, if a country like Austria runs a high level of debt, it may not have as much negative impact on their credit rating as a developing country with not a very promising background running debt at so in short, the thresholds are different. Let's say if Austria runs a 90% GDP to debt ratio, they may not get the backlash from financial markets the same way that the Philippines might get that at a far lower threshold of say 50-60%. So do you get my point? I agree with the variegated view you have, but I'm going to even make it more complicated and say, with the Philippines, I'm slightly concerned. I don't buy the Dominguez argument that we need crazy fiscal consolidation, but I also don't buy the Benjamin joke na is like, kaya natin yan. Like, actually, we might have a problem with stagflation coming in. Gas prices are insane in the Philippines. I'm sure also they're in the US.
Supply, I don't think I'm not saying there are no problems. I think the problems related more into yung mga food security issues, supply issues,
right? Distributional issues.
As opposed to yung absolute percentage ng debt, which Secretary Dominguez responded to by saying we should sell government assets, we should consider raising taxes, and then Diokno comes in and says, well, no, we're more expansionary than that, which again is hinting at the possibility na, even within the Duterte administration, ang variegated yung opinions about how to the economy. And that when Diokno taking power is already evidence of kind of more fiscally expansive Philippine government. And I personally, I prefer Diokno over Dominguez on an ideological level.
And he's an economist, and he's a real economist. He's not a businessman lang, no offense.
Bago tayo matrap dito sa discussion ng debt, which I'd like to come, balik tayo dun sa
foreign policy.
Gusto ko talaga yung pag-usapan. This idea of the Philippines being a player in international policy. To what extent is it a fantasy? To what extent is it possible under a Marcos administration?
Right. So this is where I'm going to put on my international relations theory kind of hat. No, if you look at the Philippines, actually we have been classified as a middle power and quite a high level. So there was this study by a Dutch think tank that actually classified the Philippines as a mid-tier middle power. Because yung mga middle powers may high tier, lower tier. So high tiers could be something like Australia or even say Japan, right? Philippines is kind of mid-tier. Actually, we do much better than most of our neighbors in ASEAN. Bakit kamo? And that's where actually I'm indebted to you, Leloy. No, you have done fantastic, series. In one of your books, diba, you really discuss the contribution of the Philippines to the establishment of the United Nations human rights regime. So we, the Philippines, right? We have been a big element in the establishment of the post-World War order, right? We were not just America's little brown brothers. We were a force to reckon with. And you have written also extensively on that, the debates between Carlos P. Romulo and the Nerus of this world, and how the Philippines, we were a force to begin with from 1950s onwards. And in many ways, we have been one of the most reliable partners of, let's say, the coalition of liberal democracies around the world. And I'll tell you this, Leloy, I was in 2016, I was in Brussels, right? I've done many of those trips in recent years to explain our presidents, and probably I'll have to do more of that soon. I remember in 2016, I met a high-level EU official, and this is when Duterte just won, no? And he came to me and said, look at this advertisement that some of our colleagues were making. And that advertisement was this: Philippines EU, bastions of democracy, like partners in promotion of human rights, etc. Philippines, rising tiger economy, right? And he look at me and say, where do you think we're heading under Duterte, right? And obviously I said, I'm not sure about that, right? So what I'm saying is that 2016. So actually, in fairness, by the time of President Aquino, we were already a middle power player. Leloy, let's not forget the Philippines is the first and only country that took China to international court over the South China Sea disputes. And the South China Sea is potentially the battlefield of the 21st century. The massive resources, the strategic location, it's at the heart of US-China competition in the Indo-Pacific. And guess what? The Philippines was the country that actually had the guts to take China to international court. But more than that, I'll tell you, Leloy, and please, I hope our listeners are not looking at this in a partisan fashion. I'm purely focusing on this from a IR theory perspective. Don't worry, I have things to say about Duterte and Marcos that are not too bad too, right? Going back to this, Aquino also was one of the few leaders in Asia that actively called on America to play more important role in this part of the world. This is the time when Obama was launching his pivot to Asia. Philippines was...
Seryosohin mo yan.
Seryosohin mo yan. Ayusin mo yan. Kailangan namin yan. But even more, Lelo, I'll tell you this. we also push for Japan to play a more important defense role. So if you remember, Aquino gave this important speech, historic speech before the Japanese Diet, and essentially said, no, you are not the problem anymore, unlike the Second World War, right? You are not the... Tapos na, right? You're not... And that Japan can actively contribute to international peace and security. And Shinzo Abe, who's like the, you know, the big guy about overhauling Japan and making it normal country, meaning no more constitutional restriction and projection of power, etc. He loved Aquino. I mean, Aquino visited Japan like 7 times or something like that. Super close sila. Marami sa mga Japanese projects ngayon na nag-credit grabe yung iba. Simula yan ni Aquino yan eh. Na-sign nila ng 2015, yung subway sa Manila. So don't worry, Lalo, maybe after 5 years may subway na tayo sa Manila. Yung mga North-South Express. Lahat yan, a lot of that, really Pinoy. So I would say the Philippines was becoming a player. Now, going to Duterte, we became a player but in a different way, right? We became the disruptor-in-chief of Asia, right? Duterte comes in and he goes completely 180 degrees to the other side. Yeah, exactly. He gave the middle finger to everyone. He goes to China. Even the Chinese were shocked. He goes there and says, it's me, Russia, and China against the world. Tapos ako parang, paano yung North Korea, Syria? Parang inichepwera mo sila, nauna sila sa'yo, di ba?
Kahit yung Chinese mo, ayaw maniwala.
They, like, what's going on? Right? They would call me. So I was in China in early 2017, giving a talk sa Tsinghua University. And I could see all of them were watching me to like decipher this mystery of Duterte. How can this happen, right? So over the next 5 years, I had to explain to the Chinese, wag niyo seryosohin din masyado si Duterte. Like, he doesn't control foreign policy also. It's the military, etc. I wrote an op-ed on New York Times, not Duterte's personal army. So my argument held. I predicted that the military and defense establishment will make sure Duterte doesn't wildly go in another direction. But that's the point. That Duterte made us also a player. I don't think his execution was as good. I think sometimes it looked like he wants to change U.S. for a more predatory, for a predatory alternative. But in a way, the level of interest in the Philippines just shot through the roof. I remember, again, going back to you, see how such a nice guy I am, right? Remember, I think someone quoted you as saying, I think Vicente said, we had a talk and Leloy said, Philippine studies is now essentially Duterte studies or something like that, right? Like, yeah, exactly. Like, ang ganda nun eh. Parang true yun eh. Like, suddenly because of Duterte, everyone is interested in the Philippines because as much as I have 100% respect for President Aquino, the problem though was many people still saw us as an appendage or addendum of America, right? But when Duterte came in, suddenly the Philippines was up for grabs. Suddenly the Philippines is fluid, is exciting, no? And over the next 5 years, internally, it's also fluid. You had situations whereby Teddy Boy Locsin comes out on TV and says, may binibigay silang agreement sa amin, joint development, ayaw namin sign yan. Gusto ng mga pro-China yan. Like, where do you get that, right? And then Lorenzana openly calls China bully and all of that. He never gets fired. Unlike in US, Matis had to go. So, suddenly Philippines is so exciting because the domestic is crazy, the foreign policy is crazy. So let me tell you, my friend, we are a player, for better or for worse. The question is, how do we use that card, that attention that we get? I mean, I lost count of how many invitations I get all around the world talking about the Philippine foreign policy and all. Which brings us to Marcos, diba? Because I think Marcos is in a unique situation of pulling off, to use the Hegelian term, negation of negation, right? Making sure we don't have the shortcomings of the Aquino era and the more traditional Filipino president, but also we curb the excesses of the Duterte era. And so far, I know people are going to criticize me, so far so good. You see, if you look at the key positions that have to do with our foreign policy, DFA and DND, both of them went to people who come from the ranks. In the DND, we have General Boy Faustino, right? Who was the AFP chief before, head of army.
It be like a Lorenzana type DND?
Very similar to Lorenzana. But the difference is, maybe here I'm a bit biased because Secretary Lorenzana has been a good friend. We have been in constant conversation over the years. The thing with Lorenzana that he's a special guy because Lorenzana spent a decade in Washington, D.C. as our defense and veterans attaché. So he knows very well American politics and he's very, very familiar with think tank world, the wonky world. Kaya nga, nag-hit off kami kaagad because I talk like the CSISs and, the Brookings and all. He's very familiar with that. I don't know if that's going to be the case. I hope with General Faustin it's going to be the same because Secretary Lorenzana was very open to dealing with think tank people, policy intellectual people. Let's hope that will continue. Remember, the DND was supposed to go to Sara Duterte, right? Multiple times. So that's something. And then sa DFA, Marcos is doing something which is even better than all previous presidents, at least in the recent history. He puts Enrique Manalo, one of the most veteran, respected diplomats you ever can imagine, as the head of the DFA, when so many others, loyalists, opportunists, high profile, high rollers, wanted that position. But no, in the end, he goes for a career officer, which I think is the best thing to do for us. And you could see in the first weeks after winning the presidency, Marcos immediately sends a signal, I'm not Duterte. In what sense? Under Duterte, chismis yan ng mga cabinet ni Duterte na parang parating andon yung Chinese ambassador whispering daw to Duterte.
Oh my God.
Parati daw. May nagsabi pa nga bad breath daw yung isa. Ay, hindi ako nagsasabi yan ha. Medyo cabinet niya yan. Ay, hindi ko nasabihin sino ha. Parati andun. Sabi, may nag-joke nga kung pupunta ka doon sa logbook ng Malacanang, purong yung Chinese ambassador nandun. Perfect attendance, di ba? Marcos, first few days, he goes there and he meets the Indian, the South Korean, the Japanese, and the American charge d'affaires and ambassadors, right, who are there. And he has 3 high-level exchanges with the Americans just weeks after winning the presidency, even before his inauguration. Biden is the first foreign leader to call him, and he recognizes that. He says, see, I'm called by America, so no problem. And then Wendy Sherman...
Inibita na pala ni Biden to Washington.
Exactly. And Wendy Sherman, the number 2 in the State Department, reassured him, your court cases in America is not going to be an issue. And Leloy, on the record, I told people a month ago or so, hindi magiging problema yan kasi may konsepto ng sovereign immunity. Because I remember very well Narendra Modi, the tatay of India, right? He was implicated in the pogroms in Gujarat in the early 2000s. Maraming namatay doon. So he was allegedly involved. I'm not going to pass any judgment on that. So actually, he was denied visa in the US for a long time. But once he became Prime Minister, inayos nila. Planchado na yan.
Oh, iba yan. Hindi yan parang Bato de la Rosa, Senator of the Republic.
He's the President of the Republic. They have to deal with him. And Marcos is very much aware of the sweet spot, strategic sweet spot the Philippines finds itself in. Thanks to Duterte, we showed that we are a wild card. Thanks to Aquino, we showed that we can also be a bastion of rule of law and be a reliable American ally. So Marcos is saying, which version of the Philippines you want to get? Come and deal with me. Let's get it on. That's what he's doing right now, yeah.
Pero itong idea of Marcos's own version of independent foreign policy, it's not a retread of Duterte. In a way, it's a kind of tribute to his father.
Father, exactly.
Remember, ang unang isa sa mga pinakaunang American allies na nag-open ng diplomatic relationship.
Right.
Actually, ang pinakaunang American ally na nag-open ng diplomatic relationship with China was Ferdinand Marcos. You can fact-check me on that kung siya yung pinakauna. Definitely siya yung isa sa mga
Depending on how you define ally. Yes, so 1975, bumisita sila. So you see these pictures of Mao Zedong and Imelda here and Bongbong here. Alright? Hindi na siya baby. Medyo malaki na siya. 1975 pa lang, right? I'm not even talking about 1980s, right? Na naka-camouflage and all siya. So you could see Marcos was a master synthesizer on multiple levels, right? Especially on foreign policy, I would say. As I said, my stance on Marcos' human rights and democratic and economic record. In fact, I'm more critical on his economic record than you. I think that's where I'm even more critical. But on foreign policy, you can call me revisionist, but I think Marcos did a very good job for the Philippines. So if you look at it, he used yung mga dating membro ng Partido Komunista ng Pilipinas to open communication channels with the Soviet Union, right? And there were diplomatic missions to the Soviet Union and with the Warsaw Pact countries, Romania, etc. At the same time, we normalized ties with...
Paliwanag lang natin sa viewers natin kung ano yung Warsaw Pact.
Alright, so let's not forget, Marcos Sr. was the president in one of the worst times to be a Southeast Asian, right? You have Vietnam War, Third Indochina War is about to come, Korean War was just behind us, right? Crazy time, right? Tapos nag-aaway yung mga Ruso at saka Amerikano, right? With the Chinese playing both sides, right? So that was the situation right now. So Marcos essentially comes in here and say, okay, we're U.S. ally.
Warsaw Pact essentially yung mga ally ng
So
Soviet
on one hand, you have America and its allies, the NATO North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So it extends from essentially America all the way to Turkey, right? all of these countries, right? And then on the other hand, you have the Warsaw Pact, which is Soviet Union, Russia, and Central Asian countries, and Ukraine. And then Warsaw Pact also extends to Central European countries, Eastern European countries, Poland, Hungary, Romania, Czechoslovakia back then, all of these kinds of countries, right? So what Marcos did was this. Okay, mga Amerikano nandito, pero kung umaasa lang tayo sa mga Amerikano, wala tayong makukuha dyan kasi they'll take us for granted, right? But if we open communication channels with their rivals, right, and multiple centers of power, we have leverage, right? So he opened economic and social communication channels with the Soviet Union, and then also he opened communication channels with China, and then later on was among the first U.S. allies to normalize ties with them. But as, of course, you know, Lelo, I mean, that was also important because my communist insurgencies at home. So if we can make friends with their patron abroad, baka babawasan yung suporta sa kanyang mga headaches at home. So it also had a national security aspect to it, not only foreign policy aspect.
And of course, yung mga Amerikano na yun, yung assumption nila at that time was that so the Soviet Union and Russia, the Soviet Union and China, their only goal was to spread communism. So if you deal with them, sasaksakin ka nila sa likod, they're going to promote communist insurgency in your own country. And the insight of Marcos was, they're not as ideological as they were before. There's a kind of foreign policy realism at play. And you can see this in the interview niya with William Buckley, which I recommend people listen to. In the middle of the interview, he's like useless. He just orates. But towards the end of the interview where he explains foreign policy, dun lumalabas yung utak ni Marcos.
Yeah, yung brilliance niya no, on foreign policy. Yeah, I mean, Marcos himself was a realpolitik guy, right? And he could read it in others, right? And he knew that there was a Sino-Soviet split already, right? After the death of Stalin, Mao Zedong comes out and says, hey, why should we be second fiddle to the Soviet Union, to the Russians? We can be a force of ourselves, right? And as you have also written, China began to flirt with third world countries. Kaya andun si Zhou Enlai, nandun sa Bandung, etc. So Marcos was smart. He realized, puro kunyari lang mga ideological, but these guys are brutally realpolitik too. And just read the history of Russia, you know why, right? It's a tough place to rule, right? So he was good in exploiting those things.
Yeah.
But you know...
And also, he had good, even on foreign policy, because we tend to think of technocrats as just those economic managers.
Right.
Actually, at that time, this was the height of Carlos P. Romulo, who was at the height of his powers. Kasi ang dami na niyang na-serve na presidente, gamay na niya yung takbo ng international community before. And people respected him. So if Marcos sent him abroad, they knew who CPR was, and they knew that he was speaking for the president, and he could really negotiate for the president.
Right. I mean, you can say Kissinger was the white Romulo, right? I mean, not Romulo being the Kissinger of Asia. Nauna si Romulo. He's a Pulitzer Prize winner. He headed the United Nations at some point. So I'm saying, like, Romulo was really a force.
If Romulo were alive, he would have loved that statement, Richard.
Right, exactly. Yeah, Kissinger is the Romulo, the white Romulo, right? Or that kind of sounded wrong. Romulo of the West. Let's put it that way. He's the Romulo of the West. Because I think nauna siya, and I think was a brilliant guy. No, I mean, the thing is this, Lelo, where I think Marcos was also very, and this is where I think his son is taking notes, because he's always in the shadow of his father, and sometimes not necessarily for bad reason. You see, speaking of Kissinger, there's a reason why I've suddenly brought Kissinger into conversation, as much as I see some parallels with Romulo, is that in the 1970s, the Americans had a big worry. Alam mo yung worry nila, Leloy? Na ang Pilipinas ay masyadong active sa West Philippine Sea. Kissinger was scared that the Philippines was becoming the bully in Southeast Asia, right? Remember, we built yung airstrip sa Pag-asa late 1970s. Paano ni Marcos to? Nauna tayo sa China, nauna tayo sa Malaysia, nauna tayo sa Taiwan. Ginaya tayo ng mga ibang bansa na yan. Sinong gumawa nan? Paano ni Marcos yan? So Marcos had the foresight to know that this will be a military theater down the road. This will be a geopolitical landscape of competition down the road. So, in the 1970s, biglang Kissinger was worried, like, nako po, itong mga Pilipino, medyo mayabang sila, binubuli nila yung iba. Siyempre, America was also playing different sides, Vietnam against China, Malaysia. So they didn't want to be dragged by the Philippines into war with other potential partners in Southeast Asia. So what happens is that, and this is a root of one big problem we have in the US, which kind of helped Duterte, Kissinger talks to Nixon and they come up with a doctrine. The doctrine is strategic ambiguity. In theory, we're allies with the Philippines, but we'll never clarify whether we'll come to the Philippines rescue kung nagkaroon ng hidwaan ng Pilipinas at mga ibang bansa sa West Philippine Sea. And the worry was because the Philippines was keep on pushing the envelope. In fact, the term Kissinger used was carte blanche. His fear was, we don't want our alliance with the Philippines to be used as a hammer by the Filipinos to keep on getting islands away from Vietnam, Malaysia, Taiwan, and other countries. See, that's how proactive Marcos was when it comes to defending our West Philippine Sea. And that is why his son cannot be seen, and he understands that he cannot be seen as a pushover in the West Philippine Sea. That is why presidential election period pa lang, as much as he said, we want diplomacy with China, as much as he got ICC, ICJ wrong, yes, I'm not in denying that, that's on the record. But he also said, I remember SMNI debate, I don't know if you watch it, but I watched it. And there are multiple rounds, may finale pa sila, they juiced it out. In the SMNI debate, they spent 1.5 hours on foreign policy, which was mind-boggling, and I love it. That never happens in COMELEC debates or debates in mainstream. He said, we will deploy warships to show strength to China, dyan sa West Philippine Sea. And then, after winning the presidency, he even backed it up furthermore. He said that, we will not sacrifice an inch of our sovereignty, blah, 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 blah. Now, sasabihin mo, di ba si Tatay Digong sinabi na jet ski, this is where it comes to... First of all, Tatay Digong said jet ski only towards the end of his speech, whereby he was essentially saying, let's cut a deal with the Chinese, right? And then after he wins, it's all about soft landing. He keeps on saying, we want soft landing, we want soft landing. I don't hear any soft landing as far as Marcos is concerned. But Lelo, let me also add this point. This is where I believe there are structural limitations that Marcos Jr. cannot violate. And the structural limitations are twofold. One is, China's trust rating is negative 30 in the Philippines, right? Because of every...
Nagawa si Digong about that, no? He tried his best.
He tried his best, but it kept on backfiring because the Chinese thought the Philippines is Cambodia. You got Hun Sen, everything else follows. They didn't understand Duterte is just one of the players and that the Philippines is a wild democracy. So whenever the Chinese bullied us, bullied our fishermen, what they did in Reed Bank, what they did in Whitsun Reef, average Filipinos don't listen to Duterte anymore. They listen to their conscience. They listen to their patriotism. So the surveys are very clear. China has a negative 33 trust rating in recent years. US has plus 70. Japan has plus 60. The other one is the military. I've conducted surveys with our friends there. I've had conversation a lot with folks inside our armed forces and all. They're not pro-US, to be clear about it. That's not true. But they're skeptical of China, and they see China as our number one external security threat. That never went away, and Duterte never controlled the military.
Deeply ingrained yun.
Deeply institutionalized yan because they're training with Americans, with Australians. Their armaments, 90% of our weapons are from America, NATO grade. Kaya nga nahihirapan tayo to buy from Russia and other countries eh. Kasi masyado...
May interoperability.
You cannot have a Samsung, Samsung keyboard and iPhone screen. It doesn't work that way. You get what I'm saying? Yeah.
Pero Richard, meron akong narinig na sa isang interview ni now President Marcos, kandidato pa siya at that time, it was with Thinking Pinoy. Sabi niya that prior to the arbitration ruling ni Noynoy, we had a modus vivendi with China. Tapos sa tingin niya, the arbitration ruling ruined that modus vivendi. So I was a bit, I was a bit shaken by that. Parang nakakatakot, parang sobrang pro-China nung angle. That narrative is essentially a Chinese narrative. Na maayos na lahat, sinihirapan ni Noynoy.
Yeah. No, probably he was talking about the mutual disengagement plan from Scarborough, which ironically was negotiated by Trillanes, right? A bête noire of their side. So maybe he was referring to that. But the reality is that it didn't work. There's no evidence to suggest that China would have been nicer to us if we were nice to China. Case in point, Duterte. Duterte has been the nicest ever thing that happened to China as far as the Malacanang and Philippines is concerned. And look at the last 5 years. The situation got worse in the West Philippine Sea. More militarization, more militias harassing us, and then Reed Bank happened. That didn't happen cannot happen under us, right? So the situation actually got worse. And ito lang ang sinasabi, nasaan yung investments ng China? Nasaan? The only one I know is yung sa may Rockwell na mag-cross ka ng Pasig. Ganito yan, Leloy. It's like a 4-lane road. You go to a bridge na 2-lane, then it becomes 4-lane again.
Tsaka di ba sila rin yung Chinatown Bridge na...
Yeah, exactly. Tapos yung worker Chinese, yung engineer Chinese, parang, hello, goodbye, yung movie na yan, parang, hello, goodbye. Parang, wala tayong nagawa doon, wala tayong nakuha doon, di ba? big ticket infrastructure investment. Japan invested a lot in the Philippines. Thank you. Salamat sa Japan.
Yes,
but
yeah.
a lot. But
Richard, let's move to the other side of this equation. Kasi
Yeah.
China and US, yun yung polls na navigate ng president natin. I heard you in an interview, I think it was with Howie Severino, and you said that the Marcoses are too obsessed with their image, especially their image in the West, to just completely burn the relationship with the US. In fact, you think they'll probably repair some of the damage that Duterte did.
Yeah, which goes back to what you were saying. I don't watch as much bloggers' videos as you perhaps, but I understand why Marcos. I think Marcos was hedging at some point because I think his fear was he will win the presidency, but his mandate will be questioned because of everything you know, right? That is why in one of his first press conference after winning, he emphasized expressly that Biden called him and Biden was the first, and that because our mandate is so overwhelming, everyone acts. So like you could see he's conscious. He's conscious about acceptance.
Congratulate si President Biden sa kanya kaysa kay President Duterte.
Exactly, right? Nauna pa kay Xi Jinping by 5 days, I think, right? So you could see it. The US is playing its card very well, Leloy, no? I mean, this is empire strategy. So the US knows the Marcoses are looking for affirmation. I mean, Duterte will never be accepted by the West, and Duterte doesn't care about the West. The Marcoses are a completely different ballgame. They're products of the West. They're culturally West. Ganito, just to give you the numbers, Leloy, in 6 years of Duterte, he did not visit a single Western capital except when he had to pass through New Zealand to go to Peru, right? Siguro nag-CR lang siya sa airport. Wala pang 6 days na panalo ni Bongbong, nasa Melbourne na siya, right? Where you took your PhD, right? I mean,
pero dahil para sa anak naman niya yun, di ba? Because his son.
but that's my point. His children, I mean, yung isa Oxford Brookes, yung isa LSE, yung isa Australia, Lisa NYU yung masters niya. I'm so New York, right? Not Cubao, but real New York, right? New York University. Bongbong Marcos, Oxford, right? And of course, both Bongbong and Sandro took their boarding school also in West Sussex, right? And you can ask our friends, Lord De Vera and all, they'll tell you, Bongbong Marcos is a kind of aficionado of underground British music. He knows genres and artists that I don't even have an idea of their existence, right? He's geek really in the music. So he's so
a hipster.
Exactly. And then compare him to Duterte. There's accusation that he was sexually molested by an American when he was young, right? There is that Mindanao factor. America, I mean, if you want to see the dark side of America, maybe ask people in Mindanao, right? They have an abundance of memories. Duterte after, remember the Mayring incident where kind of a suspected American operative, something fishy happened with him in Marco Polo Hotel nila Dominguez yata, diba? And then he was shepherded out by, I think, FBI, and Duterte was pissed off. Few years later, he convinces the Davao City Council to block Balikatan exercises, and he did not allow Americans to use the airbase in Davao for their counter-terror operation. So, think of that, park that in a corner, and then think of what the Marcoses. Kennedys, Nixons, Reagans, Oxford, Wharton, etc. Of course, annoyed sila with the court cases and everything, but that's exactly what Wendy Sherman told him. Don't worry, as long as you're president, that's not going to be an issue for you. So, they're totally
Wendy
different.
Sherman is Deputy Secretary of State, diba? Mataas to, no?
And she's the number 2. She's the most senior deputy. She was also Deputy Secretary of State under President Obama. So, we're talking about very senior people. We thought she could be the Secretary of State, pero Blinken ang kumuha nun. But, so Wendy Sherman is not just anyone, right? So, essentially, they're now negotiating his visit to the White House, which is totally different from Duterte, right? The history in Mindanao, he's refused. And remember, Duterte, saan siya nag-aral? Ay, kailan siya nag-aral? Panahon ng Vietnam War, 70s. So this is the anti-American era. You have to understand his zeitgeist, his thinking, his exposure.
Yung activist milieu ng Lyceum at that time.
Exactly,
Diba?
exactly.
Joma.
Right. Joma, Nurmisuari, right? Sino mga kaibigan ni Marcos? Party people, Western people, right? Kennedys,
Yeah,
diba?
yeah,
I mean,
you know,
they're just... Kaya nga, sorry.
For our party people, a reference that the president might understand.
Yeah.
Actually.
So Leloy, in short, if Duterte's are, I don't know, Huawei, the Marcoses are Tiffany and Co., right? I mean, they're completely different. I'm talking about aspiration, of course. I mean, they're the Tiffany and Co., right? They want...
Richard, tataba ka dyan.
I know, they like the glitz and glamour, right? I mean, I think literally Amy was in Tiffany blue during the inauguration, or Tiffany green. I pay attention to those things because this is a Marcos thing, the glitz and glamour. I think it's more a Romualdez thing. I think it's more of Imelda. But that's the thing, that they're totally different ball game from Duterte's. But to be clear, China will be an element of Marcos' foreign policy because he needs the money. Because infrastructure spending is expensive. Duterte only finished, I don't know, barely 10% of his big-ticket infrastructure projects, according to the DPWH data. Saan ka kuha ng pera ngayon, di ba? With all these fiscal limitations that we're facing right now. Jokno said, tuloy-tuloy ang deficit spending, but at some point, there are going to be some pushback. And not to mention, by the way, Leloy, there's also debate within the Marcos administration. I talked to Secretary Balisacan the other week, and Secretary Balisacan was saying, maybe we also need more PPP, bring in the private sector. Maybe we need more focus on health and human capital. Huwag tayo masyadong focus sa hard infrastructure, soft infrastructure din kailangan natin. So, let's see where this is going. But if you are Marcos right now...
Infrastructure, yun yung big ticket, yun yung malaki, yun yung visible, yun yung macho di ba?
So, yung edifice complex, which it goes back to Louis Napoleon, right? Napoleon III, right? All the way to Marcos and Duterte. I think Marcos, if he wants to continue the infrastructure build-up and kind of go with the tradition of edifice complex, he needs money. And U.S. clearly cannot provide it alone, but nor China. So I think he will try to have what you call, and now let me throw it out, equilateral balancing strategy. What I hope is that it will be a dynamic equilateral. Have good enough relationship with multiple powers, cross them over, get the most benefits, and push your national interest forward. And if he does it well, he got my 100% support on that, not on other issues, but on that.
So, I just want to bring it to a close now, and I'll ask kind of like a really just big question. What are your expectations for foreign policy for the next 6 years? What are your major predictions at this point?
Wow, that's a tough one. I mean, we're talking about the three-dimensional chessboard here, right? So much will depend on what Xi Jinping will do. I think China is in a very difficult and tricky situation. They're going to have leadership transition. We're not sure if there'll be any successor to Xi Jinping. China is very problematic in terms of they're dealing with the COVID-19. So maybe Xi Jinping...
Their economic growth is slowing down.
Slowing down. Their pandemic management is bad. Yeah, people are angry in Shanghai, in Beijing, big cities. It's not looking good. In fact, I got to know that China is now canceling. Remember, China keeps on hosting all sorts of sports events over the past 10 years. Chengdu, Shanghai, Xiamen, like they're canceling a lot of those now. So things are not looking good for China. So my fear is Xi Jinping might have the temptation to do something on Taiwan maybe, right? In the near future, right? Now, that will affect us because we're next to Taiwan, we're US ally, will be affected. Damay-damay to. Diba? Bardagulan to eh. Kaya nga even si, what's his name? Marcos Jr., what's his name? To mention that is in the inauguration. And then with the US, most likely the Republicans will be back soon, right? My goodness. I mean, what's happening in the US is crazy, right? So, ang dami kasing wild card eh. So, let me put it this way. The steady one in the next 6 years is the Philippines, not China and the US. That's how crazy this is. Philippines is the steady one. Marcos Jr. will be the dose of sanity, considering how crazier things are, potentially in China and the US in the coming years. Kaya nga ako, I'm a big supporter of middle power diplomacy. Because ayoko that our fates as nations will be determined by the whims of two superpowers. I want Australia, I want Japan, I want India, I want South Korea, I want all of them to play an important role in the region.
ASEAN, of course.
ASEAN, of course. Indonesia, Vietnam. If we don't get our act together, and now I'm going to say Philippines is a middle power too, or at least potentially middle power. If we don't do anything like that, the two elephants are going to trample upon all of us. So we're not...
I guess it needs to be said in the context of ASEAN. We're not a middle power. We're huge players.
Yes, exactly. We're not the grass upon which the elephants will step upon. We're the giraffes and the zebras and the lions. We can make a difference, to use the zoo analogy, right? So I don't believe we're just the grass and they're the two big... I don't believe that. Kasi ito, Lelo, just look at the numbers. Pag sinama mo yung economy ng India, Japan, and Indonesia, matapatan mo na yung China eh. You don't even need...
Yun lang, oh.
Yeah, yun lang eh. At saka China is slowing down. Indonesia is picking up. India is still growing fast because their potential is high. And I'm not going to underestimate Japan. I'm not going to underestimate Korea. So I want to end on this note because I think this is the problem we have in international relations discussion, especially in media, but also among friends. We make it look as if the world depends only on these two superpowers, when in fact, we are in such a complicated world. We have climate change, we have technological disruption, AI, and dami natin problema, terrorism, whatsoever, that I don't think either US or China are in a position to deal with them on their own. Neither of them are as relevant as superpowers used to be. we're entering a more multipolar order, and middle powers have to play an important role. And if I were the foreign secretary of the Philippines or a strategy of the Philippines, I will push us to be a big player among the emerging middle powers of Asia and in the Pacific. I think we can do a lot. We got the language skills, we got the pizzazz, right? We got great diplomats, we got great thinkers. We have some weight in international events. In fact, you know what, I was recommending the Philippines should also come up with its own version of Shangri-La Dialogue. So this is a big dialogue in Singapore where every year top defense experts and defense... I think we should have that. Let's call it Indo-Pacific Dialogue. They should come to Manila. Marcoses are in charge, so they know how to do the glamour. Let's make the Philippines, maybe not great again, but at least let us make us more glamorous and important in the region. And kayang-kaya natin yan. I'm 100% for that.
And with that note of optimism, maraming salamat, Richard A. Darren, for joining us in Basaganang Trip sa Ulitin.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. Hope to join you next time, not at 1 to 2 a.m. I hope I was coherent enough, but looking forward. My pleasure.
Thank you.
Recording stopped.
Okay, bro, I'm gonna let you sleep.
No problem. I think I'm gonna jog this out and then sleep. Thank you very much, bro. That was fine. Thank you very much also to our supporters. Can you believe it? We still have people watching us at 2 a.m. now.
Oh my God.
I know, yeah. Dito sa... True, the government should invest more on its people and not so much structure. Sabi ni Mitch Canoy, sabi ni Iska naman. But they're both...
Facebook Live mo yun?
Yeah.
Interesting.
They're hearing us. They're making comment. Meron pa nga eh. Hey, Darianistas and Leloistas. Meron na tayo mga dito. Mga, BTS Army. Thank you very much, bro. I know you have a travel to prepare for. Pack, safe trip, ingat, and see you soon, brother. Let's meet in person. And then sila Ambeth and Ola, kausapin natin. God bless. Thank you very much. Ingat. Wait lang, picture tayo before we go. Let's do one. Gusto ka ako yung sa taas eh. Ba't ikaw sa taas? Joke. Nah.
Okay.
Nah, I'm just kidding. Sige bro, have a good night. Ingat.
Bye-bye.
Regards. Ayan. Thank you very much, guys. Ayan na. Wow! Metaphor na tayo. Oh my goodness, it's 2 a.m. This is insane. This is crazy. Thank you so much sa mga loyal friends natin who stayed with us. Ayan talaga si Mitch, talagang Mitch. Matulog na kayo. Walang tulugan. Kailangan ko na mag-jog ngayon to get the stress out of the system. Medyo nag-overwork tayo today. Thank you very much, folks. Thank you so much. Thank you kay Ima, Grisaya. Ito, thank you kay... Yan. So, you know. Gracia pala, sorry. Gracia, sorry. Ima Gracia. Thank you rin kay Vilma Alberto. Thank you guys, ang dami niya. 2 a.m. na, matulog na tayo. I-release namin yung mga videos and podcast namin soon, alright? Don't worry guys. Thank you very much. God bless. Talk to you soon. Metaphor na tayo today. Metaphor. Literally.